anything sharing its water. The shadow it casts is enormous. Its body, longer than a city bus, cuts through the water with a kind of terrible elegance, propelled by a powerful, flattened tail that sweeps side to side in long, rhythmic strokes. Its eyes, positioned on either side of a massive skull, scan the blue-green columns of light filtering down from above. Its jaw, lined with conical interlocking teeth and armed with a second set of teeth further back along the roof of its mouth, opens slightly, tasting the chemical signatures dissolved in the seawater, reading the ocean the way a reader reads a page. Somewhere ahead of a school of large fish scatters. They are right to scatter. This is the Mosasaurus. And for a brief, brilliant, terrifying stretch of geological time, it owned the sea. Welcome to one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of life on this planet. Tonight, we are going deep, scientifically, historically, and ecologically, into the world of the Mosasaurus and its relatives, the mosasaurs. A group of marine reptiles so perfectly engineered for oceanic dominance that they rose from relatively modest lizard-like beginnings to become the undisputed apex predators of the late Cretaceous seas in what amounts to, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. We are going to examine how they lived, how they hunted, how they raised their young, how they competed, how they interacted with an entire ocean ecosystem that was richer and more complex than most people realize. And we are going to talk about how they died not because they were weak, not because something better came along and outcompeted them, but because the world itself broke, catastrophically and completely, in a way that left no room for creatures of their extraordinary, highly specialized scale. This is a story about success, about specialization, about the terrifying beauty of an animal perfectly matched to its environment, and ultimately it is a story about fragility because even the most dominant predator that has ever ruled an ocean can be erased when the ocean itself begins to die. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now, let us begin. The world that made them. To truly understand the Mosasaurus, you cannot simply look at the animal in isolation. You cannot pull it out of its context, place it on a white background, and admire its teeth and its tail and its remarkable size and think that you have understood it. An animal is not just a body. An animal is a relationship with its environment, with its food, with its competitors, with the chemistry of its water and the temperature of its sea, and the structure of its food web stretching all the way down to the microscopic organisms at its base. To understand the Mosasaurus, you have to understand the world it inhabited, and that world was profoundly, almost incomprehensibly different from anything that exists on Earth today. We are talking about the Late Cretaceous period, a span of geological time running roughly from about 100 million years ago to 66 million years ago. The Earth during this time was a genuinely alien planet by our modern standards, even though it was the same planet, orbiting the same sun, built from the same materials. The configuration of the continents was radically different. The Atlantic Ocean, which we think of as a vast, permanent feature of the globe, was in the Late Cretaceous a much younger, narrower body of water, still widening as the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea continued its long, slow process of breakup. The continents themselves were arranged in positions that created ocean circulation patterns, climate zones, and current systems entirely unlike those of the modern world. Perhaps most dramatically for our story, global sea levels during the Late Cretaceous were dramatically higher than today, significantly higher, in fact. We are talking about sea levels perhaps 100 to 200 meters higher than the present day. The implications of this for the geography of the planet were enormous. Land masses that are today dry, elevated, and continental were then submerged under warm, shallow epicontinental seas, bodies of seawater that spread across what are now interior continental regions, creating vast, sun-warmed, biologically productive shallow marine environments that simply have no modern equivalent in terms of their scale and distribution. These shallow seas were not the cold, deep, nutrient-limited ocean environments we sometimes imagine when we think of prehistoric seas. They were warm, they were well lit, at least in their shallower reaches. They were rich in nutrients carried down from surrounding land masses and upwelling from deeper waters, and they were teeming, absolutely teeming with life at every level of complexity, from the single-celled photosynthetic organisms at the base of the food web, all the way up to the massive, multi-ton predators at its apex. The climate of the Late Cretaceous was significantly warmer than today's. There were no polar ice caps in the modern sense. The poles were cold, certainly, but they were not covered in the vast permanent ice sheets that characterize our current planet. Tropical and subtropical conditions extended much further toward the poles than they do today. Warm water marine environments were correspondingly more widespread, providing the kind of thermally stable, food-rich habitat that large marine reptiles require to maintain their body temperatures and support their energetic demands. The atmosphere itself was different. Carbon dioxide concentrations were considerably higher than today, contributing to the elevated greenhouse warming that kept the planet so uniformly warm. Ocean chemistry was different as a consequence, more acidic in some ways, though the marine ecosystems of the time had evolved in response to those conditions over millions of years and were in their own equilibrium. The ocean was not in any sense a dying or stressed environment during the peak of the Late Cretaceous. It was in fact an environment of extraordinary biological productivity and diversity. It is into this world, warm, shallow, productive, geographically alien, that we must place the Mosasaurus to understand it properly. This animal did not evolve in a vacuum. It evolved in response to specific ecological pressures, specific prey availability, specific competitive dynamics, all of which were shaped by the particular characteristics of late Cretaceous ocean environments. When we understand the world, we begin to understand the animal. Identity: what exactly was a mosasaur? Before we go any further into the ecology and behavior of these remarkable animals, we need to settle a question that comes up repeatedly whenever the topic of Mosasaurus arises, particularly in popular culture. What exactly was it? Because there is genuine confusion on this point, confusion that is both understandable and worth addressing carefully, because getting the identity of the Mosasaurus right is the foundation for understanding everything else about it. The Mosasaurus was not a dinosaur. This is perhaps the most important clarification to make, because in popular imagination, all large, spectacular prehistoric animals have a tendency to get lumped together under the broad heading of dinosaur, particularly anything that lived during the Mesozoic era and had large teeth. In a vacuum. It evolved in response to specific ecological pressures, specific prey availability, specific competitive dynamics, all of which were shaped by the particular characteristics of late Cretaceous ocean environments. When we understand the world, we begin to understand the animal. Identity: what exactly was a mosasaur? Before we go any further into the ecology and behavior of these remarkable animals, we need to settle a question that comes up repeatedly whenever the topic of Mosasaurus arises, particularly in popular culture. What exactly was it? Because there is genuine confusion on this point, confusion that is both understandable and worth addressing carefully, because getting the identity of the Mosasaurus right is the foundation for understanding everything else about it. The Mosasaurus was not a dinosaur. This is perhaps the most important clarification to make, because in popular imagination, all large, spectacular prehistoric animals have a tendency to get lumped together under the broad heading of dinosaur, particularly anything that lived during the Mesozoic era and had large teeth. But dinosaurs were a specific, well-defined group of animals, characterized by specific anatomical features that related to their upright posture and their particular body plan. They were predominantly terrestrial animals, and while some of them were certainly capable of wading or swimming, none of them were the fully marine creatures that the mosasaurs represent. The Mosasaurus was a reptile, and more specifically, it was a squamate. The squamates are the group of reptiles that today includes lizards and snakes, and this is the group to which the mosasaurs belonged. They were in the most fundamental sense marine lizards, extraordinarily modified, enormously enlarged, and spectacularly adapted for life in the open ocean, but marine lizards nonetheless. Their closest living relatives are, somewhat surprisingly, the monitor lizards, those large, predatory lizards found today in parts of Africa, Asia, and Australia. Animals like the Komodo dragon, the largest living lizard species, represent, very distantly and imperfectly, something of what the terrestrial or semi-aquatic ancestors of the mosasaurs might have resembled. The evolutionary transition from a land-dwelling or shore-dwelling lizard to a fully marine predator capable of growing to lengths of 15 meters or more is one of the most dramatic examples of adaptive radiation in the fossil record. It is a transition that required fundamental reorganization of nearly every aspect of the animal's biology, its body shape, its locomotion, its sensory systems, its reproductive strategy, and its physiology. And it happened with remarkable speed in geological terms, unfolding over millions of years that represent, against the backdrop of the history of life on Earth, a relatively short and concentrated burst of evolutionary change. The mosasaurs as a group first appear in the fossil record in the early part of the Late Cretaceous, around 98 million years ago, as relatively modest-sized animals, some of them only a meter or two in length, showing the early stages of adaptation to aquatic life while still retaining some features suggestive of their terrestrial ancestry. By the end of the Cretaceous, roughly 30 million years later, they had diversified into an extraordinary array of forms, ranging from relatively small, agile species to the enormous apex predators like Mosasaurus itself, which could reach lengths approaching or exceeding 15 meters and would have weighed many tons. The genus name Mosasaurus, meaning Meuse lizard, comes from the Meuse River in what is today the Netherlands and Belgium, near which some of the first and most important fossil specimens of these animals were discovered in the late 18th century. It is a name that has been attached to the genus since the early 19th century, and it has given its name to the entire group of animals, the mosasaurs, or more formally the Mosasauridae, that includes dozens of species spread across multiple genera, inhabiting ocean environments across the globe during the final roughly 25 million years of the Cretaceous period. Within the mosasaurs, the genus Mosasaurus itself belongs to a subgroup called the mosasaurines, which also includes other large and ecologically significant animals like Prognathodon, a robust-jawed mosasaur that was in many ways a direct competitor of Mosasaurus in the same ocean environments. The mosasaurines were generally characterized by relatively robust builds, powerful jaws, and large body sizes, and they occupied the role of top-tier marine predators in their ecosystems. But the mosasaurs more broadly were a diverse group. There were forms with blade-like teeth suited for cutting fish, forms with rounded, crushing teeth suited for processing hard-shelled invertebrates like ammonites and turtles, forms with long, slender snouts like modern gharials that suggest specialization for catching fast-moving prey, and forms like Mosasaurus itself, with the generalized but powerful dentition of an animal that could take a wide variety of prey, and that was large enough to have very few practical constraints on what it could eat. This ecological diversity within the mosasaur group is one of the things that made them so successful as a whole, even as individual species within the group had their own particular niches and specializations. Understanding that the Mosasaurus was a squamate, a modified lizard, rather than a dinosaur changes how we think about its biology in important ways. As a squamate, it almost certainly had scales, though the structure and arrangement of those scales was modified from what we see in terrestrial lizards to suit an aquatic lifestyle. Recent fossil evidence, including exceptionally preserved specimens that retain traces of soft tissue, has given us real information about the nature of mosasaur scales, and we will discuss that evidence in detail when we come to talk about mosasaur anatomy. As a squamate, it had a fundamentally lizard-like skull architecture, though modified in profound ways that we will examine closely. And as a squamate, it reproduced in ways that connect it to the reproductive biology of living snakes and lizards, though again, with modifications that reflect its fully marine lifestyle. The origin story from shore to sea, the transition of the mosasaurs from terrestrial or semi-aquatic origins to fully marine existence, is one of the great evolutionary narratives of the Mesozoic, comparable in its drama and in the scale of biological reorganization involved to other famous marine transitions, like those that produced the whales and dolphins from terrestrial mammalian ancestors, or the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs from earlier Mesozoic reptilian lineages. To understand how the Mosasaurus came to be the animal it was, perfectly engineered for oceanic life, we need to understand where it came from and how that transformation unfolded. The ancestral mosasaurs, the animals that gave rise to the entire mosasaur lineage, were almost certainly semi-aquatic or shore-dwelling lizards of moderate size. The fossil record for the very earliest stages of mosasaur evolution is imperfect and fragmentary, as is typical for transitional evolutionary stages, where the animals involved are neither common enough nor widespread enough to leave abundant fossil remains. But we have enough early mosasaur material, combined with our understanding of their squamate relationships and the comparative anatomy of living squamates, to reconstruct the broad outlines of this transition with reasonable confidence. Animals like Dilophosaurus, known from the late Cretaceous of what is now the southern interior of the continent, represent something close to the early stages of mosasaur evolution. Dilophosaurus was a small animal, perhaps less than a meter in length, that already showed some mosasaur-like features in its skull and teeth, while retaining limbs that were more paddle-like than fully flipper-like, suggesting an animal in the early stages of aquatic adaptation, capable of locomotion both in shallow water and on land or shore environments. It is the kind of animal that helps us understand the mosasaur transition by showing a snapshot of the intermediate stages. What drove this transition to the sea? This is a question that is difficult to answer with certainty for any lineage, because the selective pressures operating on populations of animals tens of millions of years ago cannot be directly observed. But we can reason about likely drivers based on what we know about the environment and the ecology of the time. The late Cretaceous seas were extraordinarily productive and rich in food resources. Fish were abundant and diverse. Ammonites, coiled, shelled cephalopods related to modern nautiluses, were present in staggering numbers and diversity, representing a massive, widely distributed, and energetically rewarding food source for any predator capable of accessing them. Marine invertebrates of many kinds were present in shallow coastal environments in great abundance. For a lizard lineage living near the shore, the sea represented an almost inexhaustible food source, and the selective pressure toward better aquatic adaptation, better swimming ability, better underwater prey detection, better breath hold capacity, better hydrodynamic body shape would have been intense and continuous over many generations. Animals that were slightly better at exploiting marine food resources would have had a survival and reproductive advantage over those less capable. And over millions of generations, this cumulative selection pressure would have driven the lineage progressively further into aquatic specialization, until the descendants of those original shore-dwelling lizards were no longer capable of terrestrial locomotion at all, no longer laid eggs on land, and spent their entire lives in the open ocean. This kind of transition, semi-aquatic ancestor to fully marine descendant, has happened multiple independent times in vertebrate evolutionary history, and the mosasaurs represent one of the most spectacular and well-documented examples. The speed of the transition, at least as measured in geological time, is remarkable. Within a geologically short period after the first mosasaur-like animals appear in the fossil record, we have fully marine forms of impressive size, suggesting that once the transition to marine life began in earnest, the evolutionary process of optimization for that lifestyle proceeded rapidly. The early mosasaurs that were making this transition had to solve a suite of interconnected biological problems. Locomotion in water is fundamentally different from locomotion on land, and a body plan evolved for walking is not efficient for swimming. The limbs needed to transform from weight-bearing structures used for terrestrial locomotion into hydrodynamic appendages, flippers useful for maneuvering in water, while the primary propulsive force for swimming shifted to the tail. The skull needed to become more streamlined while retaining and enhancing the predatory capabilities essential for catching fast-moving marine prey. The sensory systems needed to adapt to an underwater environment where vision, chemoreception, and the detection of vibrations in water all become more important than they were in a terrestrial context. Reproduction presented a particularly interesting problem. Lizards and most other reptiles lay eggs, and eggs require dry land, or at least a moist terrestrial substrate, for incubation. A fully marine animal that could not come ashore could not lay eggs in the traditional squamate manner. The solution that the mosasaurs evolved and that we know about from direct fossil evidence was live birth, retaining eggs within the body until the young were sufficiently developed to survive in the open ocean, and then giving birth to live young directly into the water. This is a reproductive strategy also adopted independently by the ichthyosaurs among Mesozoic marine reptiles, and it is found in various forms among living squamates, including many species of sea snakes and some skinks and other lizards. It represents a fundamental adaptation that freed the mosasaurs from any dependence on terrestrial environments and allowed them to become truly oceanic animals. Anatomy of a predator, the mosasaurus body. Now we come to the anatomy itself, the physical architecture of Mosasaurus, and this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary in its detail and its elegance. Because what the fossil record reveals, when examined carefully and comprehensively, is an animal of remarkable biological sophistication. Not a blunt instrument of evolutionary process, not a clumsy giant thrust into an oceanic environment it was imperfectly suited for, but an animal so well matched to its ecological role that every major feature of its body seems to speak to the refinement of millions of years of selection for precisely this way of life. Let us begin with the overall body plan, because this is what sets the stage for everything else. The fundamentally elongated torpedo-shaped body, significantly more elongated than its lizard ancestors, with a relatively long trunk and an extraordinarily powerful tail that a substantial proportion of its total body length. This elongated, streamlined body plan is one of the clearest signatures of aquatic adaptation, reducing hydrodynamic drag and allowing efficient movement through water. It is a body plan that convergently evolved in other highly successful marine vertebrates across geological history, in ichthyosaurs, in some plesiosaurs, in cetaceans, in large pelagic sharks, because physics constrains the range of efficient solutions to the problem of moving through water, and the elongated, streamlined torpedo shape is among the most efficient. The tail of Mosasaurus was not simply an elongated version of a terrestrial lizard's tail. For a long time, paleontologists assumed that mosasaur tails were essentially cylindriated, providing propulsion through lateral undulation of the entire body in the manner of many lizards swimming today. But fossil evidence, particularly exquisitely preserved specimens that retain outlines of soft tissue, has revealed a more sophisticated picture. The tail of at least some mosasaurs had a distinct downward bend in the vertebral column near its end, and this bend was associated with the development of a fluke, a horizontal, blade-like fin structure at the tail's tip, similar in general concept to the tail flukes of sharks and dolphins, though achieved through different anatomical means. This tail morphology is highly significant from a biomechanical perspective. A tail with a well-developed, stiffened fluke can generate propulsive thrust much more efficiently than a simple tapering, undifferentiated tail, because the fluke acts as a hydrofoil, generating lift with each stroke that translates into forward thrust. The evolution of a fluke tail suggests that these animals were not simply sinuous, whole-body undulators in their swimming style, but were moving toward a more economical, tail-powered locomotive. The bulk of the propulsive effort was concentrated in the tail's sweeping strokes. This is consistent with other mosasaur skeleton, suggesting a shift in locomotor style toward tail-driven propulsion. The vertebral column of Mosasaurus shows modifications that would have made the front portion of the body relatively stiff and the tail region more flexible, concentrating the undulatory movement needed for swimming in the caudal region while keeping the trunk and head relatively stable. This is the same general pattern seen in fast-swimming fish and in cetaceans, and it represents an efficient solution to the challenge of high-speed, sustained swimming in an open ocean environment. The four limbs of Mosasaurus were modified into flippers, paddle appendages that had lost their individual flexible fingers in the functional sense, with the underlying finger bones retained within the flipper, but enclosed in a common integumentary sheath and unable to move independently as they would in a terrestrial limb. These flippers were not the primary propulsive organs. That role belonged to the tail, but they served important functions in maneuvering, in making fine adjustments to course and direction during a hunt, possibly in maintaining stability against sustained swimming. The front flippers were generally ones, suggesting they played a more active role in steering and maneuvering. The overall impression of the Mosasaurus body, when reconstructed from the fossil evidence with attention to the soft tissue indicators available from the best preserved specimens, is of an animal beautifully intermediate in its general design between the sinuous whole-body undulation of a large lizard swimming and the more refined, tail-powered propulsion of a large, fast-swimming fish. It was not as hydrodynamically refined as a large, fast shark or a dolphin. Those animals represent many more millions of years of optimization for high-speed aquatic locomotion, but it was far more capable in the water ancestry might suggest. Effective, sustained, open, capable of pursuing a wide range of large, fast-moving prey. Size most immediately strikes Mosasaurus. Careful attention. Mosasaurus, large animals, just Mosasaurus themselves, largest marine Cretaceous. Estimates of length based on specimens, individuals 15 to 50, with some suggesting that per individuals greater length. Mass difficult to make with what a 15 was all multi, perhaps into many tons. Assumptions and tissue. Perspective. The largest individual Mosasaurus specimens were larger than the largest individual great white sharks known today, comparable in length to a full-sized sperm whale bull, though far less massive overall, given the very different body proportions, and significantly larger than any living reptile. They were, by any reasonable measure, enormous animals, and their size was not merely impressive but ecologically significant. Being large provides a predator with the ability to take a wider range of prey sizes, provides a degree of protection from competitors and potential threats, and for an animal in a thermally stable warm ocean environment, offers physiological benefits related to heat retention and metabolic regulation. The growth of Mosasaurus to these large sizes was not a slow, decades-long process in the manner of large reptiles like crocodilians, which grow very slowly throughout their lives. Evidence from growth rings preserved in mosasaur bones, similar to the annual growth rings in trees, these bony growth records allow paleontologists to estimate growth rates and ages, suggests that mosasaurs grew relatively rapidly, particularly in their early life stages. This rapid growth is more consistent with a metabolism elevated above typical lizard levels than with the slow, ectothermic metabolism characteristic of most living squamates. The question of mosasaur metabolism and thermoregulation is a complex and still debated one, but the evidence from growth rates, from isotopic analyses of their bones and teeth, and from consideration of their ecological role as sustained pursuit predators in a marine environment all suggest that they were not simply giant cold-blooded lizards. Their physiology was likely more active and more elevated than that. The skull and the jaw architecture of a predator. If the body of Mosasaurus is impressive, the skull is extraordinary, a masterpiece of predatory engineering that rewards careful examination and detail. The Mosasaurus skull is large, robust, and built around the core function of seizing and processing large, struggling prey in a marine environment. Every feature of its construction reflects this purpose, and understanding the skull is understanding the predatory strategy of the animal. The skull of Mosasaurus is elongated, with a relatively long snout and a deep, powerful lower jaw. The overall skull shape is somewhat reminiscent of that of a large monitor lizard, reflecting the squamate ancestry of the animal, but it is substantially modified from the ancestral condition in ways that reflect both the demands of aquatic predation and the sheer scale of the animal. The bones of the skull roof are relatively heavy and robust, providing the structural framework needed to resist the stresses generated by seizing and struggling against large prey. The temporal region, the area of the skull behind the eyes, is organized in the squamate manner, with a relatively open construction that allowed the large jaw muscles to work efficiently. The teeth of Mosasaurus are perhaps the most immediately recognizable and most frequently discussed feature of the skull, and they are genuinely remarkable. The main tooth row in both the upper and lower jaws consists of large, robust, conical to slightly recurved teeth set in deep sockets, what is known as a thecodont tooth attachment, similar to what we see in crocodilians and in many dinosaurs. These teeth were replaced throughout the animal's life, with new teeth growing beneath and eventually replacing worn or broken ones, again, a pattern seen in many other reptiles. The curvature of the teeth, slightly backward pointing, is mechanically significant. A prey animal struggling to escape from such a tooth would find that its own muscular effort merely drove the tooth deeper into its flesh, making escape increasingly difficult. The teeth are not serrated like a shark's teeth, which are designed primarily for cutting through flesh and bone. They are more designed for gripping, for establishing and maintaining a secure hold on a large, powerful, struggling prey animal. This distinction tells us something important about Mosasaurus feeding behavior. This was not primarily a slicer and a biter, not an animal that took enormous bites from prey too large to swallow whole, cutting away chunks of flesh in the manner of a large shark. It was more of a grip and swallow predator, an animal that seized prey whole or very nearly so, and then worked it down the throat, taking advantage of the specialized jaw mechanics that allowed it to ingest items of impressive size. And here is where one of the most fascinating and ecologically significant anatomical features of Mosasaurus comes into the story: the pterygoid teeth. In addition to the main tooth rows on the upper and lower jaws, Mosasaurus, like other mosasaurs, possessed a second set of teeth on the pterygoid bones, which are bones located on the roof of the mouth, forming part of the palate. These pterygoid teeth are smaller than the main jaw teeth, but are nonetheless functional and important. They are directed generally backward, toward the throat, and they serve a clear and important mechanical function. They provide additional gripping points to prevent prey from escaping once seized, and they assist in the process of working prey items toward and into the throat for swallowing. This palatal dentition, teeth on the roof of the mouth, is a feature shared with snakes and many other squamates, and it is one of the pieces of evidence pointing to the fundamental squamate nature of the mosasaur skull architecture. In snakes, particularly large constrictors and venomous species that swallow large prey, the palatal teeth play a crucial role in the walking of prey down the throat, a process in which alternating movements of the left and right sides of the jaw progressively advance prey items into the digestive tract. Mosasaurs likely employed a similar jaw-walking mechanism, modified and scaled up to suit their much larger size and their marine prey. The mosasaur jaw is also remarkable for its kinesis, its ability to flex and move in ways that a simple, rigidly constructed jaw could not. In squamates generally, the jaws tend to be more kinetic, more capable of independent movement of their component parts than the jaws of other tetrapods, and this kinesis serves to increase the jaw's capacity to engulf prey of substantial size relative to the head. In mosasaurs, and particularly in the larger genera like Mosasaurus, this kinesis was presumably of great practical significance in allowing the animal to swallow prey items that would have appeared, at first glance, far too large to ingest whole. There is a joint in the lower jaw of mosasaurs, the intramandibular joint, that is also seen in snakes and in some lizards, and which allows the two halves of the lower jaw to flex relative to each other, effectively widening the gape and increasing the capacity to engulf large prey. Combined with the pterygoid teeth that helped work prey down the throat and the kinetic skull that could accommodate prey of substantial diameter, the mosasaur jaw system was a highly sophisticated prey ingestion apparatus that allowed these animals to exploit prey resources that would have been inaccessible to predators with more rigidly constructed, less flexible jaws. The sensory apparatus of the Mosasaurus skull also deserves attention. The eyes of Mosasaurus were large and equipped with a sclerotic ring, a ring of small bones within the eye that provided structural support and likely helped the eye maintain its shape against the pressure differences experienced during diving. The presence of large eyes suggests that vision was an important sensory modality for these animals, as it is for many active marine predators today, allowing them to detect and track prey in the relatively well-lit upper portions of the water column. The orbit, the eye socket, was positioned relatively high on the skull and somewhat to the side, giving the animal a wide field of view but likely limited binocular overlap directly in front, a sensory arrangement more consistent with awareness of the surrounding environment than with the precise depth perception needed for close-range strikes, though at the scale of a Mosasaurus, precise depth perception for the final lunge was probably less critical than detecting prey from a distance. Mosasaurs also possessed a specialized sensory organ on their tongue, the Jacobson's organ, or vomernasal organ, that is present in many squamates and provides the ability to detect chemical signals in the environment. Forked tongues in monitor lizards and snakes function to collect airborne chemical particles and deliver them to this organ, providing information about prey, predators, and the environment generally. In aquatic mosasaurs, the Jacobson's organ would have been tuned to detecting chemical signals dissolved in seawater, essentially a form of underwater chemoreception that would have been valuable in locating prey, particularly prey visible at long ranges. Some researchers have suggested that mosasaurs may have had a forked or notched tongue similar to that of monitor lizards, consistent with this chemosensory capability. There is also evidence from the inner ear anatomy of mosasaurs suggesting that they were sensitive to low-frequency vibrations transmitted through the water, in effect, a kind of underwater hearing that would have allowed them to detect the movements of large animals at distances beyond those at which vision or chemoreception would have been effective. Modern crocodilians have well-developed sensitivity to vibrations in water, and it is reasonable to suppose that the large marine mosasaurs similarly used vibration detection as part of their sensory repertoire for locating prey. Skin and appearance, what did they really look like? For much of the history of mosasaur paleontology, reconstructions of what these animals actually looked like, their external appearance, their coloration, the texture of their skin, the presence or absence of various soft tissue structures, were necessarily speculative and were influenced heavily by assumptions about their lizard-like nature. Early reconstructions tended to portray mosasaurs as essentially giant, aquatic monitor lizards, scaly, lizard-textured bodies, perhaps 4 functional limbs still reasonably limb-like in appearance, a relatively simple, tapering tail without flukes or fins. These early reconstructions were based on the best available evidence at the time, but they have been substantially revised by subsequent discoveries. The most important revisions have come from exceptionally preserved fossil specimens, specimens found in geological conditions that allowed preservation not just of bone, but of soft tissue outlines, skin impressions, and in some cases even traces of pigmentation chemistry. These exceptional specimens, while rare, have provided direct evidence about mosasaur external appearance that has transformed our reconstructions significantly. Perhaps the most dramatic revelation from these exceptional fossils is the confirmation of a tail fluke, a downward bending tail tip associated with a broad, flattened fin structure in at least some mosasaur species. This discovery, supported by specimens showing clear soft tissue outlines around the tail region, means that at least some mosasaurs had a distinctly fish-like or shark-like tail profile rather than a simple tapering lizard tail. This is not a minor aesthetic detail. It fundamentally changes our understanding of how these animals swam and how hydrodynamically refined they were. A fluke tail is a sign of adaptation to sustained, efficient swimming in open water, not the shallow water undulatory swimming of a lizard or crocodilian. Skin impressions preserved in some mosasaur specimens show that their scales were small and relatively uniform in arrangement, more fish-like in their clothes, overlapping arrangement than the larger, more irregular scales of many living lizards. The scales of at least some mosasaur specimens appear to have been keeled, each scale with a small central ridge, which would have given the skin a texture somewhat rougher and more complex than perfectly smooth. This scale texture may have had hydrodynamic functions, potentially reducing turbulent drag in a manner somewhat analogous to the dermal denticles of shark skin. Coloration is one of the most speculative aspects of any prehistoric animal reconstruction, because pigments are almost never preserved in the fossil record in a form that reveals original colors. However, recent advances in the chemistry of fossil preservation have made it possible in some cases to identify chemical signatures of melanin pigments in exceptionally preserved fossils, providing indirect evidence about at least the distribution of dark pigmentation. Some research on mosasaur skin chemistry has suggested that at least some mosasaur species may have had dark coloration on their upper surfaces and lighter coloration on their undersides, a pattern called countershading that is extremely widespread among modern aquatic predators, from sharks to penguins to dolphins. Countershading is an effective camouflage strategy in open water environments. Seen from above, the dark dorsal surface blends with the deep, dark water below. Seen from below, the pale ventral surface blends with the bright, lit surface above. If mosasaurs were indeed countershaded in this manner, it tells us something interesting about their ecology. Countershading is most effective as camouflage when both predator and prey are using vision to detect each other in an open water environment. It suggests that visual detection was important in mosasaur predatory interactions, both for the mosasaur detecting prey and for prey potentially detecting the mosasaur, and that these animals were active visual hunters in well-lit, open water environments, not purely deep water or crepuscular predators relying primarily on non-visual senses. There is also evidence from some mosasaur specimens of a dorsal keel or fin-like ridge running along the midline of the back, again, a feature more suggestive of a fish-like or shark-like external appearance than the simple rounded back of a lizard. The extent and exact structure of this dorsal keel varied among species and is not universally present or well documented, but its presence in at least some taxa adds to the picture of mosasaurs as remarkably fish-like in their external appearance despite their fundamentally reptilian nature. The overall picture that emerges from the best available evidence is of an animal that would have looked considerably less like a giant lizard and considerably more like a very large, somewhat reptilian marine predator, sleek, streamlined, dark above and pale below, with a powerful, somewhat shark-like tail and paddle-like limbs. Not perfectly fish-like, the lizard ancestry was still evident in the proportions of the skull, in the arrangement of the limbs, in various details of the body, but far more oceanically refined than older reconstructions suggested. Feeding behavior and prey, the question of what Mosasaurus ate and how it went about catching and consuming its food, is one of the most fascinating aspects of its ecology, and it is a question to which the fossil record provides answers at multiple levels of detail. We have evidence from the teeth and jaw mechanics about what kinds of prey the animal was capable of catching and processing. We have evidence from preserved stomach contents, actual fossilized remains of prey items found within the ribcage of mosasaur specimens, that tells us directly what some individuals ate. and we have evidence from tooth wear and damage patterns that provides clues about the nature and frequency of feeding interactions. Together, these lines of evidence build a picture of a highly successful, ecologically versatile apex predator with a broad dietary scope. Based on the robust, conical, gripping dentition and the powerful jaw mechanics described above, Mosasaurus was anatomically suited to prey upon a wide range of large marine animals. The teeth were not the delicate, blade-like cutting teeth of a specialist fish predator, nor the rounded, crushing teeth of an ammonite cracker. They were generalist, gripping teeth, capable of establishing a secure hold on prey of many types and sizes. This generalism in dental morphology suggests a generalism in diet, an animal that exploited whatever large prey resources were available in its environment rather than being narrowly focused on a single prey type. The prey available to Mosasaurus in its late Cretaceous ocean environment was extraordinarily diverse and abundant. Fish were present in enormous diversity and abundance. The late Cretaceous seas supported rich communities of bony fish and sharks, ranging from small, schooling species to large, individual predatory fish capable of growing to considerable size in their own right. These fish would have been primary prey items for a large mosasaur, both because of their abundance and because they represent a calorie-dense, nutritionally complete food source that a large predator needs in substantial quantity. Large marine turtles were another significant prey category. The late Cretaceous was a golden age of marine turtle diversity, with numerous species of varying sizes inhabiting the same ocean environments as mosasaurs. Large marine turtles are relatively slow-moving and represent a substantial, calorie-rich food package, but they are also protected by a hard shell that makes them challenging to consume for many predators. Mosasaurus, with its powerful jaws and robust teeth capable of exerting substantial bite force, was likely capable of biting through or cracking the shells of at least some marine turtle species, or of consuming turtles from exposed, unprotected angles. Evidence for mosasaur predation on marine turtles comes from fossil turtle shells bearing tooth marks consistent with mosasaur dentition, providing direct physical evidence of these predatory interactions. Ammonites, those abundant, coiled-shelled cephalopods that were such a characteristic feature of Cretaceous marine ecosystems, were likely on the menu as well, though perhaps less central to the Mosasaurus diet than to that of some other mosasaur species with more specialized crushing dentition. Some mosasaur genera, like globidans, had distinctly rounded, dome-shaped teeth clearly adapted for crushing hard-shelled prey, and these animals were probably ammonite specialists. Mosasaurus, with its more conical, gripping teeth, could certainly have consumed ammonites opportunistically, but its dental morphology suggests it was more optimized for softer, larger prey than for hard-shelled invertebrate crushing. Perhaps most remarkably, large mosasaurs like Mosasaurus were likely capable of preying upon other, smaller marine reptiles, including smaller mosasaurs and other aquatic vertebrates of comparable or smaller size. Evidence for mosasaur on mosasaur predation exists in the fossil record. Specimens of smaller mosasaurs bearing tooth marks or damage consistent with attack by larger mosasaurians. This kind of intra-guild predation by one member of a predatory guild upon another, is not unusual among top predators today. Large crocodilians will take smaller ones, large sharks prey on smaller sharks, and it would make ecological sense for an animal as large and powerful as Mosasaurus to have been an opportunistic predator of smaller aquatic vertebrates when the opportunity presented itself. The actual mechanics of Mosasaurus feeding, how it caught prey, are a fascinating subject for reconstruction and inference. For relatively slow, large prey like marine turtles or large, sluggish fish, the mosasaur could probably approach relatively slowly and strike at close range, relying on its size and jaw power rather than on particularly high swimming speeds. For faster prey like schooling fish or large, agile marine vertebrates, more active pursuit would have been necessary, and the hydrodynamic capabilities of the animal, the fluked tail, the streamlined body, the maneuverability provided by the flippers would have been brought to bear. One of the most interesting questions about Mosasaurus feeding strategy is whether it was a pursuit predator, chasing prey over substantial distances, or an ambush predator, relying on concealment and a short, explosive burst of speed to close the distance to prey before it could escape. The answer is probably both, depending on circumstances. The large body size and the tail-driven, relatively economical locomotion pattern suggest an animal capable of sustained cruising at moderate speeds, which is more consistent with active pursuit than with pure ambush predation. But the large body size also means that Mosasaurus would have had a hydrodynamic advantage over most prey simply by virtue of its scale. A longer stride in its swimming strokes, a greater absolute speed even at relatively low tail beat frequencies, and the momentum of its enormous mass once accelerated to speed. Reproduction and early life. The reproductive biology of Mosasaurus is a topic that was, for many years, a matter of inference and supposition rather than direct evidence, based primarily on the logic that a fully marine animal that never came ashore could not have laid eggs in the terrestrial manner of most reptiles. That inference has been confirmed and enriched by actual fossil discoveries that provide direct evidence about mosasaur reproduction. The most dramatic evidence comes from specimens that preserve, within the abdominal region of adult mosasaur skeletons, the remains of what appear to be embryonic or newborn mosasaurs, tiny, incompletely ossified skeletons of animals clearly in the earliest stages of development, found in a position consistent with them having been carried internally by the adult at the time of preservation. These specimens provide direct evidence of live birth, viviparity, in mosasaurs, confirming the inference drawn from their fully marine lifestyle. Live birth in mosasaurs parallels the reproductive strategy of the ichthyosaurs, the other great group of fully marine Mesozoic reptiles, which are also known to have been viviparous from exceptionally preserved specimens showing embryos within the adult body. It also parallels the reproductive strategy of many living marine squamates, particularly sea snakes, many of which are viviparous and give birth to live young in the water. What do we know about the early life of baby mosasaurs? This is a difficult question to answer definitively because juvenile mosasaur specimens are considerably rarer in the fossil record than adult specimens, which is typical for many vertebrate groups. Since juveniles are smaller, their bones are less robust and less likely to be preserved, and they often inhabit different environments from adults, which itself contributes to biases in preservation. But the juvenile specimens that are known provide some interesting information. Baby mosasaurs were not tiny. Even newborn or very young mosasaurs were substantial animals by the standards of most marine predators' offspring, likely measuring a meter or more in length at birth, fully capable of swimming and feeding independently from the moment of birth. There is no evidence of parental care in mosasaurs, and the functional maturity of even very young individuals, their teeth were fully formed and apparently functional from birth, suggests that neonatal mosasaurs were immediately self-sufficient, active predators. This is consistent with the live birth strategy. The extended internal development that viviparity allows means that the young are born at a more advanced stage of development than they would be if they had hatched from externally laid eggs at an earlier developmental stage. The fact that juvenile mosasaurs appear to have been rare in the same environments where adult specimens are common has led some researchers to suggest that juvenile mosasaurs inhabited different environments from adults, perhaps shallower, coastal, reef-associated environments, where juveniles could find prey more easily and faced less competition from large adults of their own species and from other large predators. This kind of ontogenetic habitat partitioning, where juveniles and adults of the same species use different habitats, is seen in many living aquatic vertebrates, including various shark species, and it represents an ecologically sensible strategy for reducing competition between age classes and providing young animals with environments where their small size is less of a disadvantage. The growth trajectory from a meter-long neonate to a 15-meter adult was presumably rapid, at least in the early phases of growth, based on the bone growth evidence discussed earlier. Rapid early growth would have been advantageous for multiple reasons. Larger juveniles are safer from predation, better able to capture prey, and in a warm water ocean environment with abundant food, the caloric resources to support rapid growth were presumably available. The time required to reach adult size is unknown with certainty, but was probably measured in years to decades rather than centuries, consistent with an elevated metabolic rate and active lifestyle. The Mosasaurus in its ecosystem, neighbors and competitors, the Mosasaurus did not inhabit an empty ocean. Its world was a crowded, complex, richly interactive ecosystem in which it was the largest and most powerful element, but was by no means the only significant one. Understanding Mosasaurus in ecological context, understanding who else lived in its ocean, what role those other animals played, and how Mosasaurus interacted with them, is essential to a complete picture of this animal. At the very top of the predatory hierarchy, sharing the apex predator role with Mosasaurus, were other large mosasaurs. This is one of the ecologically most interesting aspects of late Cretaceous marine ecosystems. At certain times and in certain locations, multiple species of large mosasaurs coexisted in the same ocean, apparently partitioning the available prey resources through differences in their preferred prey types, their preferred habitat depths and zones, and their particular hunting strategies. Prognathodon was one of the most significant of these large mosasaurian competitors. In some ways a similar animal to Mosasaurus in terms of its overall large size and robust build, Prognathodon is distinguished by its particularly massive, strongly built jaws and its robust, somewhat crushing-type teeth dental morphology, suggesting a specialization for particularly hard prey items, including possibly turtles and large ammonites with thick shells. Where Mosasaurus and Prognathodon coexisted, and there is fossil evidence for their coexistence in some time periods and locations, they likely occupied somewhat different ecological niches, with Prognathodon's specialized jaw and tooth architecture giving it access to particularly armored or hard-shelled prey that Mosasaurus might have found more difficult to process. Other large mosasaurs that coexisted with Mosasaurus in various times and places included Tylosaurus, a very large mosasaur with a distinctively elongated, blunt-tipped snout that may have been used in ramming or stunning prey. Platecarpus, a somewhat smaller and more maneuverable mosasaur with a body plan suggestive of active fish chasing in relatively open water, and Haenosaurus, another very large mosasaurid whose size rivaled or perhaps even exceeded that of Mosasaurus itself. Each of these species had its own particular anatomical specializations and ecological characteristics, contributing to a complex mosasaur community that partitioned the available resources of the late Cretaceous ocean among multiple top predators. Below the large mosasaurs in the predatory hierarchy were smaller mosasaurian predators, as well as entirely non-mosasaurian predators of various kinds. Sharks were a constant and significant presence in late Cretaceous marine ecosystems, and some late Cretaceous shark species were themselves of impressive size and predatory capability. The shark fauna of the late Cretaceous was diverse, including both relatively small, agile reef-associated species and larger, more open ocean predatory forms. While none of the late Cretaceous sharks approached the enormous size of Mosasaurus, they were important elements of the ecosystem, likely filling niches at intermediate levels of the predatory hierarchy and competing with juvenile and sub-adult mosasaurs for fish and other mid-sized prey. The relationship between large mosasaurs and sharks in late Cretaceous ecosystems is a complex and ecologically interesting one. There is fossil evidence suggesting that sharks scavenged on mosasaur carcasses. Shark teeth have been found associated with mosasaur bone in ways consistent with feeding on dead mosasaurs rather than attacking living ones. There is also some evidence of possible antagonistic interactions between living sharks and large mosasaurs, though distinguishing predatory attacks from scavenging in the fossil record is often difficult. In general, it seems likely that large, healthy adult Mosasaurus individuals were essentially immune to shark predation simply by virtue of their enormous size. There were no late Cretaceous sharks large enough to successfully attack a healthy, alert, full-grown Mosasaurus, but that sharks may have been opportunistic predators of sick, injured, or juvenile mosasaurs, and certainly would have scavenged mosasaur carcasses whenever the opportunity arose. Marine birds were present in late Cretaceous ecosystems as well. The late Cretaceous saw the evolution of the earliest truly marine birds, the Hesperornithiforms, a group of diving birds that had reduced or eliminated their wings in favor of powerful legs used for underwater pursuit of fish, convergently recapitulating in a warm-blooded avian lineage some of the same adaptations for marine life that the mosasaurs achieved in their reptilian lineage. These birds were not competitors with Mosasaurus for prey. They were far too small to take the same prey as a large mosasaur, but they shared the same general ocean environment and presumably avoided the areas where large mosasaurs were actively hunting. And then there were the plesiosaurs, the other major group of large, fully marine Mesozoic reptiles, which coexisted with mosasaurs throughout much of the late Cretaceous. Plesiosaurs were a fundamentally different group from the mosasaurs, not squamates, but members of a separate reptilian lineage that had adapted to marine life even earlier in the Mesozoic. They came in two main body plan varieties: the long-necked forms, Plesiosaur sensu stricto, with small heads on extremely long necks and barrel-shaped bodies, and the short-necked, large-headed forms, Pliosaurs. By the time Mosasaurus appears in the fossil record, the pliosaurs, which had been the dominant marine apex predators of much of the earlier Mesozoic, were already declining and had largely disappeared, leaving the later Cretaceous seas to be dominated by the mosasaurs rather than by the pliosaur lineage. The long-necked plesiosaurs persisted alongside the mosasaurs throughout the late Cretaceous, right up to the end Cretaceous extinction event. These animals, including the famous Elasmosaurus with its extremely elongated neck, were primarily fish-eaters, catching fish with their small, needle-like teeth in the manner of a heron or tern wading through a school of fish, but in 3 dimensions underwater. They were not apex predators in the sense that Mosasaurus was. They occupied a different ecological tier, as large but not top-tier predators feeding on fish and other relatively small, fast-moving prey. Their relationship with Mosasaurus was probably one of ecological coexistence with some prey competition, particularly for medium-sized fish. Large mosasaurs may have been opportunistic predators of smaller plesiosaurs, and there is some fossil evidence consistent with mosasaur attacks on plesiosaur individuals, though as always, distinguishing predation from scavenging in the fossil record is challenging. It is certainly plausible that a large Mosasaurus encountering a smaller or compromised plesiosaur would have treated it as potential prey, given the opportunistic generalism of the Mosasaurus diet and the overall predatory dominance of these animals in their ecosystems. The geography of Mosasaurus, where did they live? Mosasaurus was not an animal confined to a single ocean basin or a single geographical region. The fossil record of the Mosasaurus genus and of mosasaurs more broadly reveals a distribution spanning multiple ocean basins and continental margins, reflecting both the connectivity of late Cretaceous ocean systems and the ecological versatility of these animals. Understanding where they lived and why adds another dimension to our portrait of these remarkable predators. Mosasaurus fossils have been found on nearly every continent, a distribution that reflects the global reach of the warm, shallow epicontinental seas that characterized the late Cretaceous world. Specimens have been recovered from geological formations in what is today Europe, Africa, the interior of the continent, South America, and even Antarctica, a distribution that speaks to both the geographical extent of late Cretaceous marine environments and the ability of Mosasaurus to thrive across a wide range of ocean conditions. The Western Interior Seaway, a vast, shallow sea that divided the continent into eastern and western landmasses during much of the late Cretaceous, was one of the most productive and well-documented Mosasaurus habitats in the fossil record. This inland sea, warmed by the overall high global temperatures of the late Cretaceous and enriched by nutrients from surrounding terrestrial environments, supported a remarkable marine community that has been documented through exceptionally productive geological formations. The fossil record from this region is among the most complete available for late Cretaceous marine vertebrates anywhere in the world. The prevalence of mosasaur fossils in the Western Interior Seaway tells us that these animals were comfortable in relatively shallow, thermally stable, warm water environments, which is consistent with their physiology and ecology as large marine ectotherms or near endotherms that needed warm water to maintain their metabolic activity. The seaway was also exceptionally rich in the fish, ammonites, marine turtles, and other prey that Mosasaurus depended upon, making it an ideal habitat for supporting populations of large apex predators. But mosasaurs were not confined to these shallow, epicontinental seas. Evidence from the fossil record and from isotopic analyses of mosasaur teeth and bones suggests that at least some species, and possibly Mosasaurus itself, ventured into deeper water open ocean environments as well, perhaps following prey that migrated between shallow and deep water, perhaps exploiting food resources in oceanic environments unavailable to competitors restricted to shallower waters. The ability to exploit both near-shore and offshore environments would have been a significant ecological advantage, allowing Mosasaurus to access a greater range of prey resources and to avoid the most intense competition with other large predators concentrated in the most productive shallow water zones. The ocean temperature and chemistry of late Cretaceous seas varied across geographic regions, and different mosasaur species seem to have had somewhat different habitat preferences and tolerances. Some species appear to have been more exclusively shallow water, coastal forms, while others show distribution patterns suggesting more open ocean, pelagic habits. Mosasaurus itself, based on the distribution of its fossil record, appears to have been a relatively habitat generalist capable of occupying both coastal and more open ocean environments, another expression of the ecological versatility that made it such a successful predator. The fossil record, how we know what we know, everything we know about Mosasaurus, its anatomy, its ecology, its behavior, its physiology, its evolution, comes ultimately from the fossil record. The preserved remains of these animals, buried in ancient seafloor sediments for tens of millions of years, and recovered by the patient, meticulous work of paleontologists and geologists over the past 2.5 centuries. Understanding the nature of that fossil record, what it preserves, what it cannot preserve, and where its gaps and biases lie, is essential for understanding the confidence we can place in our reconstructions of these animals. Mosasaur bones preserve well under the right conditions, and the Late Cretaceous is in many regions a fossil-rich time period, with extensive exposures of marine chalk and limestone formations that were once the seafloors of the warm, shallow epicontinental seas where mosasaurs lived. These formations have yielded extraordinary quantities of mosasaur material over the years: complete skulls, partial and sometimes nearly complete skeletons, isolated teeth and vertebrae by the thousands, and occasionally the exceptional specimens with soft tissue preservation that have been so informative about external appearance and reproductive biology. The chalk formations of northwestern Europe, the same geological formations that give the famous white cliffs of Dover their color, were laid down as accumulations of calcareous shells of microscopic plankton on the floor of shallow, warm Cretaceous seas. These chalks entomb the remains of the marine animals that lived in those seas, and they have been yielding mosasaur fossils since the late 18th century. It was from these chalk formations, specifically from quarries near the Meuse River, that the first scientifically recognized mosasaur specimens were recovered, specimens whose study would have profound implications not just for our understanding of mosasaurs, but for the entire science of paleontology and our conception of the history of life on Earth. The quality of preservation in these chalk deposits varies considerably. Chalk is a relatively soft, fine-grained sediment, and while it can provide excellent preservation of delicate structures, it can also be subject to distortion and crushing over the millions of years of burial. The better preserved chalk mosasaur specimens, however, retain remarkable detail, individual teeth in their sockets, delicate bones of the skull architecture, even the fine structure of vertebrae that has allowed detailed anatomical reconstruction and analysis. In the late Cretaceous marine formations of the continent, preservation conditions are different but often equally good, and in some respects better. The marine shales and chalks of the Great Plains region have yielded spectacular mosasaur material, including some of the most complete and best preserved specimens known for several species. The isolation and subsequent detailed study of these specimens over the past century and a half has contributed enormously to our understanding of mosasaur anatomy, and the ongoing work in these formations continues to yield new and important material. The scientific discovery, mosasaurus, and the birth of paleontology, of all the contributions that the Mosasaurus has made to human knowledge, and they are many and significant, perhaps none is more profound than the role played by early mosasaur fossils in the intellectual revolution that established the concept of extinction as a scientific reality. This is a story that unfolds at the intersection of geology, natural history, and philosophy in late 18th and early 19th century Europe, and it is one of the most important episodes in the history of science. In the late 18th century, the question of whether species could go extinct, whether organisms that had once existed on Earth could permanently cease to exist, leaving no living descendants, was not merely an academic question. It touched on deep theological and philosophical convictions about the nature of creation and the completeness of God's work. The prevailing view in much of European intellectual culture was that extinction was impossible. If a species no longer existed in the places where it had previously been known, it must simply exist somewhere else, in unexplored parts of the world. The fossil remains of unfamiliar creatures discovered in geological formations were explained, in this framework, not as evidence of creatures that had ceased to exist, but as evidence of creatures that still existed somewhere, waiting to be found by explorers venturing into the world's remaining unknown regions. This comfortable assumption was challenged and ultimately destroyed by a specific fossil discovery made in a chalk quarry near the Dutch city of Maastricht, in the valley of the Meuse River, in the latter decades of the 18th century. The specimen, a massive skull with impressive jaws and large teeth, clearly belonging to some kind of animal, but unlike anything known to science, attracted enormous attention and debate. It was purchased eventually under circumstances that were themselves dramatic, involving the armies of revolutionary France and significant political intrigue, and it eventually became part of the collections of what would become the Natural History Museum in Paris. It was there, in the early years of the 19th century, that a young anatomist named Georges Cuvier began the work that would transform both the specific specimen and the broader question of extinction. Cuvier was a prodigy of comparative anatomy, a scientist with an almost supernatural ability to analyze anatomical structures and draw accurate conclusions about an organism's biology and relationships from detailed examination of its bones. When he turned his attention to the Maastricht specimen, he was able to demonstrate with meticulous, detailed anatomical argument that the creature was not a whale, as some had suggested, not a crocodilian, as others had proposed, and not any other known living animal. It was a giant lizard, a marine lizard of a kind entirely unknown in the living fauna of any part of the world that had been explored. This conclusion had a profound implication that Cuvier grasped and articulated with characteristic force and clarity. If this animal, this enormous marine lizard, existed nowhere in the explored world, and if it had once existed as indicated by the fossil evidence, then it must be extinct. Not hidden somewhere unexplored, not waiting to be discovered in a remote ocean, but genuinely permanently gone. The world had changed. This creature had not survived the change. Cuvier's work on the Maastricht specimen, combined with his analyses of other fossil specimens including elephants, ground sloths, and other large extinct mammals, constituted perhaps the most important intellectual contribution to the establishment of extinction as a scientific fact. It demolished the comfortable assumption that species could not permanently cease to exist, and it opened the door to the modern understanding of the history of life as a succession of faunas, each one replaced by the next through geological change and biological evolution. The scientific name Mosasaurus, Mews lizard, was formally given to the genus by the English scientist William Daniel Conybeare in 1822, though various names had been proposed in the preceding years. The Maastricht specimen and the species to which it belonged thus became permanently attached to the story of the river near whose banks it was found, and to the story of a scientific revolution that changed how humanity understands its world. It is worth pausing on the significance of this contribution for a moment, because it is easy to focus so exclusively on the biological interest of Mosasaurus, on its anatomy and its ecology and its predatory capabilities, that we lose sight of the equally important intellectual legacy. The Mosasaurus, through the circumstances of its discovery and the brilliance of the scientist who interpreted it, is not merely a remarkable extinct animal. It is a founding document of paleontology as a science, and an instrumental piece of evidence in one of the most important conceptual shifts in the history of natural science. Without the Mosasaurus, without that skull from the Maastricht chalk, the establishment of extinction as a scientific reality might have been delayed by years or decades. And without the concept of extinction firmly established, the theoretical foundations for Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, which depends critically on the idea that lineages can and do disappear as well as originate, would have been correspondingly less secure. The Mosasaurus is thus, in a very real sense, one of the animals that helped make modern biology possible. This is a legacy as remarkable as anything in its ecological story, and it is one that deserves to be celebrated alongside the more immediately dramatic aspects of the animal's biology. Physiology, how warm was their blood? One of the most actively debated questions in mosasaur paleobiology, and one with significant implications for how we understand these animals as living organisms, is the question of their physiology. Specifically, were mosasaurs ectotherms, relying on external environmental heat sources to regulate their body temperature in the manner of living lizards? Were they fully endothermic, generating their own body heat through metabolic processes in the manner of birds and mammals? Or were they something in between mesotherms or regional endotherms, capable of maintaining elevated body temperatures relative to their environment through some combination of metabolic heat production, behavioral thermoregulation, and the thermal inertia provided by their large body mass? This question matters enormously for how we reconstruct mosasaur ecology and behavior. A purely ectothermic large lizard is a fundamentally different animal from a warm-blooded marine predator in terms of its activity levels, its range of habitable environments, its food requirements, and its competitive capabilities. An ectotherm needs to warm up before it can operate at full capacity, is limited in its activity in cold conditions, has much lower food requirements than an endotherm of comparable size, and tends to be a burst energy rather than sustained energy animal, capable of short, intense bursts of activity followed by extended recovery periods. An endotherm, by contrast, can operate at full capacity across a much wider range of environmental temperatures, is capable of sustained activity over extended periods, but requires much more food to fuel its higher metabolic rate. The evidence bearing on mosasaur physiology comes from several independent lines of investigation, and while it does not resolve the question definitively, it strongly suggests that mosasaurs were not simple ectotherms but had a significantly elevated physiology compared to living lizards. The bone growth evidence discussed earlier showing relatively rapid growth rates, particularly in juveniles, is one line of evidence. Living reptiles with ectothermic physiology typically show much slower growth rates than warm-blooded animals of comparable size, and the rapid growth suggested by mosasaur bone histology is more consistent with an elevated metabolism than with simple ectothermy. Isotopic analyses of mosasaur bones and teeth provide another line of evidence. The ratio of different isotopes of oxygen preserved in fossil hard tissues can be used, under the right circumstances, as a proxy for body temperature at the time the tissue was formed, because the fractionation of oxygen isotopes during bone and tooth mineralization is temperature dependent. Studies using this approach on mosasaur specimens have generally suggested that mosasaurs maintained body temperatures above the ambient water temperature in which they lived, implying some degree of metabolic heat production, consistent with at least partial endothermy or with the thermal inertia of gigantothermy. The ecological context provides yet another line of reasoning. Mosasaurs were active, open-ocean pursuit predators, animals that chased fast-moving prey over potentially significant distances in three-dimensional open-water environments. This kind of sustained, high-energy predatory lifestyle is much more consistent with elevated physiology than with simple ectothermy. A giant lizard with standard reptilian metabolism would be an inefficient and likely unsuccessful pursuit predator in the open ocean, simply because it could not sustain the energy output required for prolonged pursuit at the activity levels its prey would have demanded. The current consensus in mosasaur paleobiology leans toward viewing these animals as having a physiology intermediate between typical ectothermy and full endothermy, perhaps similar to what some researchers have proposed for large, fast sharks like the great white, which can maintain elevated body temperatures through counter-current heat exchange systems in their musculature, or to the proposed mesothermic physiology of some large dinosaurs. Whatever the precise details of their thermoregulatory mechanism, the balance of evidence suggests that mosasaurs were not the sluggish, cold-blooded giant lizards of early imagination, but active, well-regulated, physiologically sophisticated predators capable of sustaining the high energy expenditures required for their lifestyle as apex oceanic predators. The diversity of mosasaurs beyond Mosasaurus throughout this narration, we have been focused primarily on Mosasaurus itself, the largest and most famous genus of the mosasaur family. But to fully understand the ecological story of these animals, it is important to step back and appreciate the full diversity of the mosasaur clade, the extraordinary variety of forms, sizes, ecological roles, and adaptations that evolved within the mosasaurian lineage during its approximately 25 million year history as a dominant component of Cretaceous marine ecosystems. The mosasaurs are classified into several distinct family groups, each characterized by particular anatomical features and ecological tendencies. The Mosasauridae, the family to which Mosasaurus itself belongs, were generally the largest and most robustly built of the mosasaurs. The Tylosaurinae, including the genus Tylosaurus, were another group of very large mosasaurs with distinctive skull proportions. The Pleoplate Carpinae, including genera like Platecarpus and Ectinosaurus, were generally smaller and more gracile, with body proportions suggesting greater agility and possibly specialization for more active fish chasing in relatively open water. And the Halosauromorpha were a group of relatively small, early diverging mosasaurs that retained some anatomical features suggestive of the transitional stages between fully terrestrial and fully marine existence. This taxonomic diversity reflects an ecological diversity that allowed mosasaurs as a group to occupy a wide range of niches within marine ecosystems, from shallow coastal and reef environments to open ocean pelagic zones, from the shallow warm water surface layers to potentially considerable depths. The variety of tooth morphologies within the group, from the needle-like teeth of fish specialists, to the conical gripping teeth of generalist large prey predators, to the rounded crushing teeth of hard prey specialists, reflects the variety of prey resources being exploited, and the variety of body sizes within the group, from animals barely a meter long to the behemoths exceeding 10 meters, reflects the variety of predatory roles being filled. At any given time during the Late Cretaceous, a single ocean environment might have contained representatives of several different mosasaur species simultaneously, each occupying a somewhat different ecological niche, and thereby reducing the direct competition that would otherwise have constrained the number of large predators the system could support. This coexistence of multiple mosasaur species, made possible by their ecological differentiation, is one of the things that made the mosasaurian adaptive radiation so spectacular and so ecologically significant. The diversification of mosasaurs through the Late Cretaceous was not a steady, gradual process. It shows patterns of accelerated diversification at some points, possibly associated with oceanographic changes that opened new ecological opportunities and relative stasis at others. The final several million years of the Cretaceous, the very latest Cretaceous, seem to have seen a somewhat reduced mosasaur diversity compared to peak diversity earlier in the period, a reduction that some researchers have interpreted as early signs of stress on the marine ecosystems that would ultimately be destroyed by the end Cretaceous catastrophe, though others argue that the apparent diversity reduction is partly an artifact of the fossil record rather than a true biological signal. Swimming the mechanics of motion, let us return in some depth to the question of how Mosasaurus actually moved through the water, because this is a question whose answer has changed significantly as our understanding of mosasaur anatomy has improved, and because the answer has profound implications for how we understand the animal's ecological capabilities and its predatory strategy. The early outdated model of mosasaur locomotion pictured something like a very large aquatic lizard, sinuous, undulating the entire body from side to side in the manner of a swimming snake or a water monitor, with the limbs playing a relatively minor role in propulsion and the tail providing additional thrust, but without any specialized hydrodynamic structure. In this model, the mosasaur was a relatively slow, sinuous swimmer, more maneuverable in confined shallow water environments than in the open ocean, and more effective as an ambush predator than as a pursuit predator. The revised understanding, based on the discovery of tail fluke evidence and on more detailed analysis of the vertebral column and its implications for locomotor flexibility, is significantly different. The evidence for a tail fluke, a broad, horizontal fin structure at the end of the tail, is perhaps the most transformative element. A fluke tail functions as a hydrofoil, converting the lateral sweeping motion of the tail into lift forces that translate into forward thrust. This mechanism is far more efficient than simple lateral undulation of an unspecialized, tapering tail, and it is the mechanism used by the fastest swimming large marine vertebrates today, sharks, dolphins, and large tunas among them. The presence of a tail fluke in mosasaurs implies a significant upgrade in swimming efficiency compared to the ancestral, lizard-like locomotor mode. The modifications in the vertebral column that concentrated locomotor flexibility in the tail region while stiffening the trunk, already discussed in the anatomical section, are consistent with the tail fluke model. A stiff trunk with a flexible tail region concentrates the sweeping motion where it can be most efficiently converted into thrust by the fluke, reducing the energy wasted in moving the entire body sinuously and allowing more directed, efficient propulsion. What swimming speeds could Mosasaurus achieve? This is a question that cannot be answered with great precision from fossil evidence alone, but biomechanical modeling based on the reconstructed body proportions and the likely properties of the tail and fluke can provide estimates. The consensus from such modeling efforts suggests that Mosasaurus was capable of sustained cruising at moderate speeds, perhaps in the range of a few body lengths per second in cruising mode, with the ability to accelerate significantly for burst speed during pursuit or attack. For an animal 15 meters long, even a relatively modest swimming speed in absolute terms represents a substantial advantage over most prey. A large, heavy animal moving at even a few kilometers per hour carries enormous momentum, and closing the distance to prey quickly enough for a successful strike becomes easier as absolute speed increases. The maneuvering capabilities of Mosasaurus in the water were probably more limited than its cruising capabilities, given the large body size and the stiffened trunk. Large animals are inherently less maneuverable than smaller ones in aquatic environments, for the same reason that turning a supertanker is fundamentally different from turning a speedboat. This limitation would have had implications for the kind of prey most efficiently caught. Large, slower-moving prey like marine turtles or large fish would have been easier targets than highly agile, fast-turning small fish that could rapidly change direction to evade a pursuing predator. This is consistent with the overall picture of Mosasaurus as a generalist large prey predator rather than a specialist fish chaser. The front and rear flippers played roles in fine-tuning direction and stability during swimming rather than in providing primary propulsion, in the same way that the pectoral fins of a shark provide steering and stability while the tail provides thrust. The larger front flippers would have been particularly important in banking during turns, sweeping one flipper backward and one forward to execute, using differential drag to change direction efficiently. Intelligence and behavior, the mind inside the skull, it is tempting, when contemplating an animal as large and physically impressive as Mosasaurus, to focus entirely on its physical attributes, its size, its teeth, its speed, its power, and to neglect the question of its cognitive capabilities. But an animal's behavior is as important as its anatomy in determining its ecological success, and even a limited understanding of the behavioral sophistication of Mosasaurus adds importantly to our picture of this animal. The brain of Mosasaurus is known from a few specimens where the shape of the braincase is well preserved, allowing endocast reconstruction, the creation of a cast of the brain's approximate shape and size. Mosasaur brains, based on these endocasts, were organized in a pattern broadly consistent with other squamates, with the characteristic elongated, relatively simple structure typical of brains. In absolute terms, mosasaur brains were large simply by virtue of the animal's large body size, but in relative terms, brain size relative to body size, the measure that most closely corresponds to behavioral sophistication, they were within the range typical of large reptiles rather than elevated into the range characteristic of mammals or birds. This does not mean that mosasaurs were simple, reflexively behaving automatons. Living large reptiles, including large crocodilians, Komodo dragons, and monitor lizards, show a range of behavioral capabilities that goes well beyond simple reflexive responses, including learning, individual recognition, and flexible behavioral responses to novel situations. Mosasaurs, as squamates with a brain organization broadly similar to that of large monitor lizards, were probably capable of at least this level of behavioral flexibility. In the context of predatory behavior, the behavioral capabilities most relevant to success are learning prey patterns, developing search image for favored prey types, coordinating approach and strike behaviors based on prey responses, and modifying hunting strategy based on experience. There is no direct fossil evidence bearing on these behavioral capabilities in mosasaurs, but by analogy with living large squamate predators, and with large marine predators more generally, it seems reasonable to infer that experienced adult Mosasaurus individuals were significantly better predators than naive juveniles, that there was a learned component to their hunting effectiveness that accumulated over years of experience and contributed to the predatory success of older, larger individuals. The social behavior of mosasaurs is almost entirely unknown from the fossil record. Were they solitary animals, maintaining exclusive territories in the manner of some large terrestrial predators? Did they aggregate seasonally for reproduction or for exploitation of particularly rich food sources? Were there social hierarchies among individuals of the same species? None of these questions can be answered definitively from currently available fossil evidence. Some very large aquatic predators today, like great white sharks, are generally solitary except during mating, while others, like killer whales, have complex social structures. The mosasaur fossil record does not provide direct evidence for large aggregations of individuals in ways that would suggest strongly social behavior, but the absence of such evidence is not strong evidence of its absence. The ocean they ruled a living system. To close the first part of our exploration of the Mosasaurus, let us step back from the animal itself and contemplate the ocean system within which it existed, because this ocean and its extraordinary biological richness was the foundation for everything that made the Mosasaurus possible. Without a productive, well-structured food web, without an abundance of prey at multiple trophic levels, without the particular climatic and oceanographic conditions of the late Cretaceous, there could have been no Mosasaurus. The animal and its environment were not merely associated, they were mutually constitutive, each defining the other. The late Cretaceous ocean was, by any measure, a biologically magnificent system. The warm, shallow epicontinental seas that characterized so much of the globe during this period were extraordinarily productive environments, analogous in some ways to the most productive shallow marine environments of today, tropical reef systems, continental shelf environments with strong upwelling, but vastly more geographically extensive. The productivity of these systems, measured in terms of the organic material synthesized by photosynthesis at the base of the food web, was the engine that drove everything else. The zooplankton that grazed on the phytoplankton, the small fish and invertebrates that ate the zooplankton, the larger fish and marine reptiles that ate the smaller ones, and at the apex of this towering structure of energy transformations, the Mosasaurus. The food web connecting phytoplankton to Mosasaurus was not a simple, linear chain, but a complex, multi-branched network of feeding relationships, with energy flowing through multiple pathways and being recycled and concentrated at each step. Ammonites, for example, were important predators of zooplankton and small invertebrates, concentrating energy from lower trophic levels into their large, energy-rich bodies, and then making that energy available to the mosasaurs and other large predators that preyed upon them. Marine turtles grazed on marine plants and invertebrates, channeling plant-based energy into animal tissue available for apex predators. Fish of many sizes occupied multiple trophic levels, serving simultaneously as predators of smaller organisms and as prey for larger ones. This complex food web was resilient up to a point. The diversity of energy pathways meant that the loss of any single component could be partially compensated by other pathways, buffering the system against local or temporary perturbations. But the system had limits to its resilience, and those limits would be catastrophically exceeded at the end of the Cretaceous. The story of that catastrophe and of what it meant for the Mosasaurus is where the second part of our exploration will take us. For now, let us hold in our minds the image of this world at its peak, a warm, shallow sea, sunlit and productive, teeming with life from microscopic to magnificent. Somewhere in those clear, warm waters, a Mosasaurus moves. It is by any measure the master of its environment, perfectly adapted, ecologically dominant, biologically magnificent. It has ruled these waters for millions of years. It expects to rule them for millions more. It does not know what is coming. The story of Mosasaurus is one of the greatest in the history of life on this planet, a narrative of evolutionary triumph, ecological mastery, and ultimately catastrophic loss. In the first part of this documentary, we have explored the origins of these remarkable animals, their anatomy and physiology, their predatory capabilities and ecological relationships, and the extraordinary ocean world they inhabited. We have seen how they evolved from modest lizard-like ancestors to become the undisputed lords of the late Cretaceous sea, and we have examined the scientific legacy of their discovery, a legacy that changed how humanity understands the history of life on Earth. In Part 2, we will continue this journey deeper into the ecology of the mosasaur world, into the competitive dynamics of their ocean ecosystem, into the final years of their dominance, and into the catastrophe that ended it. We will examine what the extinction of the mosasaurs means in the broader context of Earth history, and what these magnificent animals can tell us about the fragility of even the most successful and dominant lineages when their world changes beyond any possibility of adaptation. The mosasaurs were lords of the ancient sea. Part 2 will tell us how those lords came to fall. Please remember to leave a comment telling us where you are watching this and what time it is for you. We love hearing from every corner of the viewing world. And if you have found this exploration as compelling as we believe the subject deserves, please subscribe to the channel so you will be among the first to see Part 2 when it arrives. The story is not yet half told, and the best and most dramatic chapters are still to come. Welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, we encourage you to seek out Part 1 of this documentary, where we laid the essential foundations of our exploration. The evolutionary origins of the mosasaurs, the anatomy and physiology of Mosasaurus itself, its predatory capabilities and feeding behavior, its reproductive biology, and the extraordinary richness of the late Cretaceous ocean world it inhabited. We closed Part 1 with an image that has, we hope, stayed with you, a warm, sunlit, shallow sea at the absolute peak of its biological productivity, and somewhere within it, a mosasaurus moving through the water with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has no reason to fear anything sharing its world. In part 2, we are going to complete that story. We are going to go deeper into the competitive ecology of the late Cretaceous ocean, the rivalries, the predatory interactions, the complex web of relationships that structured the world in which Mosasaurus lived. We are going to explore what the final millions of years of mosasaur dominance looked like, and what signals, if any, existed in the ocean system that might have hinted at the catastrophe to come. We are going to examine that catastrophe in detail, the end Cretaceous extinction event, its causes, its mechanisms, and its consequences for the marine ecosystems that had sustained the mosasaurs for tens of millions of years. And we are going to reflect on what the story of Mosasaurus means, what it tells us about success and failure, about specialization and vulnerability, about the deep history of life on our planet, and the lessons that history carries for anyone willing to read it carefully. This is the story of the fall of the lords of the ancient sea, and it is, in its way, as remarkable and as moving as the story of their rise. The competitive ocean, RIVALS in the deep. To understand the ecological position of Mosasaurus fully, we need to examine in much greater detail than we have so far the competitive environment in which it lived, the other large, powerful animals that shared its ocean, competed for its prey, and occasionally represented potential threats even to the most formidable predator in the sea. Because the late Cretaceous ocean was not a simple hierarchy with Mosasaurus perched unchallenged at the top. It was a complex, multi-dimensional competitive landscape, and navigating that landscape successfully required more than simply being the largest animal present. We introduced in part 1 the concept of the mosasaur community, the coexistence of multiple mosasaur species within single ocean environments, each somewhat differentiated in its ecology from the others. Now let us examine this in greater depth, with particular attention to the dynamics of competition and coexistence among these animals. Prognathodon, the mosasaurian competitor we mentioned briefly in part 1, deserves extended attention here because it represents one of the most direct and most interesting competitive relationships in mosasaur ecology. Prognathodon was, in some time periods and locations, essentially a direct ecological neighbor of Mosasaurus, a similarly large, similarly robust, similarly apex predator-level animal, living in the same ocean, potentially exploiting many of the same food resources. How did two animals so similar in their basic ecological role coexist in the same environment without one competitively excluding the other? The answer lies in the differences in their dental morphology and the implications of those differences for prey preference. Prognathodon's teeth were notably different from those of Mosasaurus, more rounded, more strongly curved, with a crushing surface in some species that speaks clearly to a specialization for harder, more armored prey. This dental morphology is most consistent with specialization for prey that could not be easily dispatched by the conical gripping teeth of Mosasaurus, heavily armored turtles, large ammonites with thick shells, perhaps large crabs or other hard-bodied invertebrates that the more gracile teeth of Mosasaurus would have had difficulty processing. Prognathodon was, in essence, the heavy machinery specialist of the Mosasaurian ecological guild, the predator capable of cracking open prey that even Mosasaurus would have found challenging. This dietary differentiation, however partial and imperfect it may have been in practice, provided the ecological basis for coexistence. Two predators that eat exactly the same things in exactly the same proportions in exactly the same habitats cannot indefinitely coexist in the same environment. The principle of competitive exclusion, a cornerstone of ecological theory, holds that such complete niche overlap leads inevitably to the elimination of one competitor by the other. But two predators that differ in their prey preferences, even modestly, can coexist because each has a resource base that the other cannot fully exploit. Mosasaurus and Prognathodon, through their different dental architectures, appear to have achieved sufficient niche differentiation to maintain coexistence in shared ocean environments. The relationship between Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus, the large, elongated snouted mosasaur, was similarly structured around differences in anatomy that implied differences in ecology. Tylosaurus had a notably elongated, somewhat flattened snout that extended well beyond the tooth row, creating a structure that some paleontologists have interpreted as a ram, used to stun or disorient prey before the jaws were deployed for the actual capture. If this interpretation is correct, it implies a fundamentally different prey capture strategy from that of Mosasaurus. Tylosaurus may have attacked faster moving, more evasive prey that needed to be stunned before it could be effectively seized, while Mosasaurus relied on its powerful jaw grip to control prey that could not escape once seized. This difference in prey capture strategy implies at least some difference in the kinds of prey most efficiently exploited by each species. The teeth of Tylosaurus were also somewhat different from those of Mosasaurus, more pointed, perhaps more specialized for grasping slippery prey like fish, and its overall body proportions were somewhat more elongated and gracile, suggesting a more agile and perhaps faster swimmer than the more massively built Mosasaurus. These anatomical differences are consistent with at least partial ecological differentiation: Tylosaurus as a faster, more agile pursuer of fish and other swift prey, Mosasaurus as the powerhouse generalist capable of overpowering large, robust prey that a more slender animal might struggle to subdue. Beyond the mosasauran guild itself, the large sharks of the Late Cretaceous represented an interesting and complex competitive dynamic. It is worth spending some time on Late Cretaceous sharks in detail, because they are too often treated merely as background elements of the mosasaur story, when in fact they were ecologically significant participants in the same ecosystems. The shark fauna of the Late Cretaceous was extraordinarily diverse, more diverse, in terms of the number of species and ecological forms present, than today's shark fauna in many respects. Large predatory sharks of multiple lineages were present in Cretaceous seas, ranging from relatively small reef-associated forms to considerably larger, more open ocean species. Among the latter, species like Cretaxirina mantelli, sometimes called the Jinsu shark for the cutting effectiveness of its serrated teeth, were notable predators in their own right. Cretaxirina could reach lengths of perhaps 6 meters, making it a substantial predator well capable of taking large fish, marine turtles, and potentially plesiosaurs or other marine vertebrates. Its serrated, cutting teeth were quite different from the gripping teeth of Mosasaurus, optimized for slicing through flesh and bone rather than for grasping and holding struggling prey, and this dental difference implies a different feeding strategy and at least partial ecological differentiation from the mosasaurs. The relationship between Cretaxirina and large mosasaurs was almost certainly complex. For much of the early and middle Late Cretaceous, Cretaxirina and the earlier, smaller mosasaurs coexisted as co-dominant predators in some ocean environments, with the balance between shark and mosasaur ecological dominance perhaps shifting as the mosasaurs grew larger and more diverse through time. Some researchers have suggested that the spectacular diversification and size increase of mosasaurs through the Late Cretaceous was partly driven by or correlated with a decline in the largest shark species of the period, as if ecological space vacated by declining shark diversity was rapidly filled by expanding mosasaurs. The causal relationships here are difficult to establish with certainty, but the temporal patterns in the fossil record are suggestive of dynamic competitive interactions between these two great groups of marine predators. By the latest Cretaceous, the final few million years before the end Cretaceous extinction event, the mosasaurs appear to have been ecologically dominant over sharks in most marine environments, occupying the apex predator role that the largest sharks had previously shared or contested. Shark diversity in the latest Cretaceous marine fauna, while still impressive, showed some reduction compared to peak diversity, and the largest shark species of the earlier Cretaceous had disappeared or shrunk in size. Meanwhile, mosasaur diversity and maximum body size were near their peak. Whatever the specific mechanisms involved, the trajectory of the latest Cretaceous ocean suggests that mosasaurs had largely won the competition for apex predator status, a victory that would prove, in retrospect, of limited duration. Hunting strategies in depth, the art of the kill, we discussed Mosasaurus feeding behavior in part 1 at a general level, but the topic repays deeper examination, because the specific strategies by which these animals caught their prey were sophisticated, varied, and ecologically revealing. The fossil record, while it cannot provide us with direct video footage of mosasaur hunts, offers of evidence that allow us to reconstruct the mechanics of predation with reasonable confidence. Direct evidence for mosasaur feeding comes from gut contents, the preserved remains of prey items found within the rib cage of mosasaur specimens, where the stomach would have been in life. Gut content preservation is relatively rare in the fossil record generally, because soft tissues and their contents decay rapidly under most preservation conditions. But the particular preservation conditions in some Cretaceous marine formations have allowed the preservation of gut contents in a handful of mosasaur specimens, and these specimens provide invaluable direct evidence about diet. Preserved gut contents in mosasaur specimens have included fish remains, bird remains, ammonite shell fragments, and small mosasaur bones, a catalog that speaks eloquently to the ecological versatility and opportunism of these predators. The presence of bird remains is particularly interesting. The late Cretaceous marine birds, the Hesperornithiforms mentioned in Part 1, were diving birds, spending their time on the water surface or diving for fish. A mosasaur catching a diving bird would have had to approach from below, timing its strike to coincide with the bird's dive surface for the bird to dive within reach. This is a sophisticated predatory behavior, implying an awareness of prey behavior patterns and an ability to plan and execute multi-step predatory sequences. The presence of small mosasaur remains in gut contents of larger individuals is also significant. Intraspecific predation, larger individuals of a species eating smaller ones, is documented in living predators from sharks to crocodiles, and its presence in the moat suggests that juveniles faced significant predation pressure, not just from external predators but from larger members of their own species. This would have been a powerful selection pressure driving juveniles to use different habitats from adults, the ontogenetic habitat partitioning we suggested in Part 1, and would have added a layer of complexity to mosasaur population ecology. The biomechanics of mosasaur prey capture varied with prey type. For large, slow-moving prey like marine turtles, the likely strategy was a relatively slow, deliberate approach followed by a powerful strike directed at the most vulnerable exposed areas, the head, neck, or flippers, to disable the prey before attempting to swallow it. Fossil turtle shells bearing mosasaur tooth marks in patterns consistent with these attack vectors provide direct evidence for this interpretation. The marks show that mosasaurs were not always able to crack turtle shells with a single bite. Some fossil turtle shells show multiple bite marks in similar locations, suggesting repeated biting attempts, perhaps to work through the shell at its thinnest or weakest points. For fast-moving, agile prey like large fish, the strategy would have needed to be quite different. Speed and surprise would have been at a premium, and a mosasaur hunting fast fish would likely have relied on an ambush-type approach, remaining relatively stationary or drifting slowly, allowing prey to come within striking range before executing a rapid acceleration and strike. The large body size of Mosasaurus, while limiting its agility for sustained chasing of very fast prey, gave it an enormous initial acceleration advantage. The powerful tail could accelerate the large body mass to a significant speed over a short distance, and the momentum of that mass once moving was effectively unstoppable over the short ranges at which the strike was executed. There is an interesting phenomenon in modern predator-prey ecology called the predator inspection behavior, where prey animals approach and examine potential predators at close range, apparently assessing the predator's motivational state and readiness to attack. Fish and other prey animals exhibit this behavior with living large predators, and it has been suggested the strategy of slow, relaxed cruising, appearing non-threatening, might have allowed prey to approach closer than they otherwise would, setting up the explosive short-range strike. This is speculative, of course, but it is consistent with what we know of predator-prey behavioral dynamics in modern marine environments. For ammonites, which were abundantly available prey in late Cretaceous seas, the feeding strategy would have been different again. Ammonites were cephalopods, animals enclosed in a coiled, chambered shell with soft, tentacled bodies extending from the shell opening. They swam by jet propulsion, expelling water to move through the water column, and they were presumably capable of reasonably rapid escape movements in the short term. But they could not outrun a mosasaur over any distance, and their shells, while protective, were not impenetrable to the jaw force of a large mosasaur. The most efficient strategy for a mosasaurus taking ammonites would probably have been to approach from behind and above, where the prey's visual field was most limited, and to seize the ammonite body in the powerful jaws before it could execute an escape jet. The pterygoid teeth and the jaw-walking mechanism would then have allowed the prey to be worked deeper into the mouth and eventually swallowed, shell and all, in smaller specimens, or after some shell crushing and removal in larger ones. One of the most interesting and ecologically significant aspects of Mosasaurus feeding behavior is the evidence for deep diving, or at least the capability for it. Some isotopic evidence from Mosasaurus combined with physical modeling of their diving capabilities based on body proportions and estimated physiology suggests that at least some mosasaurs were capable of diving to considerable depth, hundreds of meters below the surface. This would have opened access to deep water prey resources, squid, deep water fish, and other organisms that inhabit the deeper zones of the ocean that would not have been available to a shallow water predator. The ability to exploit both shallow and deep water resources is an ecological advantage, giving these animals access to a depth range of prey items that no single-zone predator could match. The evidence for deep diving in mosasaurs includes the large, well-developed sclerotic ring in the eye, those bony support structures that help the eye maintain its shape against pressure, and the relatively large eye size overall, which is consistent with vision adapted for low light conditions at depth. These anatomical features suggest that mosasaurs were at least occasionally diving to depths where light levels were significantly reduced, requiring eyes capable of functioning in dimmer conditions than are present at the sunlit surface. This is consistent with the diving capabilities of some large marine reptiles today. The leatherback sea turtle, for example, is capable of diving to remarkable depths in pursuit of jellyfish and other deep water prey. The ammonite world, a prey base beyond reckoning, to appreciate the food resources available to Mosasaurus and the other large predators of the late Cretaceous ocean, sometime examining the ammonites because these animals were one of the most extraordinarily abundant and ecologically sources in the history of the ocean, and their story is aligned with the story of the mosasaur. The ammonopod mollusks, rare nautilus, squid, and that had been present in the world's oceans since the Devonian period, some 400 million years ago, and had diversified and radiated repeatedly through the intervening geological time's spectacular variety. The ammonites had reached perhaps their greatest diversity, with hundreds of species of varying sizes filling the Cretaceous seas. Shells, ranging from small forms a few centimeters in diameter approaching 2 meters across, are among the most characteristic fossils of Cretaceous marine diet. The ecological importance of ammonite marine ecosystems is difficult to overstate. These animals were present in enormous numbers. Their shells are sometimes found in densities in the fossil record, suggesting that living populations were effectively uncountable, filling the water column in swarms of millions or more. They occupied multiple ecological roles, as predators of small invertebrates, as scavengers, and as prey for a vast range of higher-level predators from mosasaurs to sharks to large fish to marine birds. They were terms, one of the channels through which energy levels of the marine food web animals at its upper levels. Mosasaurus, ammonites represented a widely available, calorie-dense, and relatively easily source. An ammonite, even a large one, could not fight back in a meaningful threat to an animal the size of a large. The challenge was the shell with sufficient jaw force to crush the shell of ammonites up to a certain size, and for larger ammonites, approaching from the opening of the shell to reach the soft body was an alternative strategy. The sheer abundance of ammonitous seas meant that a mosasaur hunting ammonites would rarely have to travel far to find prey, and the energy expenditure of hunting ammonite was relatively low compared to large, fast vertebrates. The role of ammonite ecosystem is really poignant when we consider what happened of the Cretaceous, because the ammonites, like the mosasaurs, linked at the K/PG boundary, their million-year evolutionary lineage ending abruptly in the same global catastrophe that ended the mosasaurs. The extinction of the ammonites was not merely itself. It was the collapse of one of the prime pathways in the marine ecosystem, contributing to the food web collapse that we will examine when we come to the extinction event. The plesiosaur neighbors, coexistence, and conflict. The plesiosaurs deserve more extended treatment than they received in Part 1, because the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs in late Cretaceous ecosystems, interesting and ecological interactions in the world. Groups of large marine existed in the same ocean environments for much of the late, and understanding their relationship, the ways in which they competed, the ways in which they partitioned resources, and the ways interacted antagonistically is an important part of the ecological story. The long-necked plesiosaurs of the late Cretaceous, the elasmosaurids, named for the famous Elasmosaurus, were remarkable animals in their own right. The Elasmosaurus itself had a neck containing more than 70 vertebrae, making the longest necked vertebrate that has ever existed relative to its overall body size. The enormous neck, combined with a relatively small head with needle-like fish-catching teeth, is consistent with the interpretation that these animals were fish specialists, using the long neck to extend the reach of the small, precise head into schools of fish, snatching individuals with a rapid net before the school could scatter. This is a feeding strategy quite different from that of Mosasaurus, and it implies ecological differentiation between the two groups. Plesiosaurs feeding primarily on fish and other small, fast-moving prey. Mosasaurs exploiting the larger prey items that their more powerful jaws and great body bulk allowed them to take. But prey competition between plesiosaurs and smaller mosasaurs for medium-sized fish was probably real and significant. Both groups ate fish, both were present in the same ocean environments. Both were large enough to compete meaningfully for similar prey size classes. The mechanisms of ecological coexistence in this overlap zone likely included some habitat differentiation. Plesiosaurs perhaps spending more time in nearshore and coastal environments, where shallow water and reef structures allowed the ambush fish catching strategy their long necks implied, while exploited a wider range of environments including more open water and some size differentiation in preferred prey, with plesiosaurs' teeth better suited to small, fast schooling fish and mosasaurs' larger, more robust teeth more suitable for larger prey. Direct predatory interactions between mosasaurs and plesiosaurs are suggested by some fossil evidence, including plesiosaur bones with tooth marks consistent with mosasaurian and at least one possible specimen suggesting a plesiosaur neck vertebra with evidence of a bite. If mosasaurs did prey upon plesiosaurs, the most likely smaller individuals and juveniles, or individuals already injury or illness. Adult large plesiosaur, an apex predator of the Mosasaurus, substantial animal capable of defenses and attacking without risk. Mosasaur. Polycodal, a different plesiosaur necks and larger Elasmosaurus, another category marine reptile ocean environments. These animals had dentition, suggesting a diet somewhat similar to that of fish-eating mosasaurs, and their interactions with the mosasaur community were likely complex. Polycodalids were generally smaller than the large mosasaurs, which places them in the role of potential prey for large mosasaurids rather than competitors of equivalent ecological status. But they were significant enough elements of the ecosystem to merit recognition in any complete picture of the late Cretaceous marine community. Disease, injury, and the evidence of hard lives, the fossil record of Mosasaurus, examined carefully, reveals not just the triumphant anatomy of a successful predator, but the evidence of the real costs of living as a large, active marine predator in a competitive ocean. Pathological specimens, fossil bones showing healed injuries, disease processes, or other signs of biological stress, provide a surprisingly intimate glimpse of the lives of these animals they faced. Or specimens with healed bone injuries are known from multiple localities and species. These pathological specimens show evidence of bone fractures that healed during the animal's lifetime, infection processes that left distinctive traces in bone structure, and tooth injuries including lost or damaged teeth. The presence of healed injuries is ecologically significant. It means that the animals survived their injuries long enough, which implies both a degree of physiological resilience and a feeding ecology that could accommodate temporary impairment. An animal that could not feed effectively for weeks or months while healing from injury would starve. The fact that injured mosasaurs apparently survived long enough to heal implies either that recovery was rapid enough to avoid starvation, or that their feeding opportunities were sufficient even in a compromised state, or that the injuries were not so severe as to completely prevent feeding. The sources of the injuries visible in pathological specimens are speculative, but likely candidates include encounters with large, struggling prey, A large fish or sea turtle thrashing powerfully in an attempt to escape could easily in the mosasaur's jaws or face with a well-timed impact and antagonistic encounters with other large mosasaurs. Intraspecific combat, fighting between individuals of the same species, is documented in many large vertebrates today, particularly in the context of competition for mates or for feeding territories, and the robust jaws of a large mosasaur would have been formidable weapons in such combat. Bite marks on mosasaur bones in positions consistent with attack by another mosasaur have been documented in several specimens, providing direct evidence for intraspecific antagonistic interactions. Dental pathologies in mosasaur specimens include broken teeth worn down to the base, and in some specimens evidence of tooth infections. The bone around some teeth showing the characteristic changes associated with infectious processes in the surrounding tissue. Broken teeth were presumably replaced through the lifelong tooth replacement that mosasaurs shared with other squamates, but severely damaged teeth, or those lost entirely, would have represented at least temporary impairment of feeding capability. Tooth wear at the base, teeth so heavily used that their crowns were substantially reduced, is interesting as evidence of the sheer volume and hardness of the material being processed by the jaws of these animals over their lifetimes. The evidence of pathology and healed injury in mosasaur specimens paints a picture of animals living genuinely hard lives, successful, powerful, ecologically dominant, but not immune to the physical cost of their predatory lifestyle. They were hurt, they recovered, they continued hunting. This is the reality of life as a large predator, and the mosasaur fossil record gives us precious direct evidence of this reality in a way that idealist reconstructions cannot convey. Global distribution and ocean connectivity. The worldwide distribution of mosasaur fossils across multiple continents and ocean basins, tropical to high latitude environments, raises fascinating questions about how the animals moved through the global ocean, how connected their populations were across geographical distances, and what their distribution tells us about the oceanographic structure of the Late Cretaceous world. The Late Cretaceous ocean was, in many ways, more globally connected than the modern ocean, not in terms of absolute water volume, but in terms of the continuity of shallow, warm marine environments across what are continental interiors. The shallow epicontinental seas that covered vast areas of continents connected to each other, and the deeper ocean basins through sea level passages and corridors, creating pathways for marine organisms to disperse across enormous geographical distances without ever leaving suitable marine habitat. The distribution of closely related mosasaur species across multiple ocean basins, separated by thousands of kilometers of open water, implies that these animals were capable of extensive oceanic dispersal, moving through open ocean environments that would have required sustained swimming over periods of weeks to months. This is consistent with what we know of their physiology and locomotor capabilities. Animals capable of sustained, efficient open ocean swimming would have had the capacity for long-distance movements, following ocean currents, prey aggregations, and suitable thermal conditions across basin-scale distances. The question of whether mosasaur populations across different ocean basins were in regular genetic contact, exchanging individuals frequently in significant genetic divergence, or whether they were isolated and diversifying independently, is one that the fossil record can partially address of morphological features across geographically separated populations. The evidence suggests a picture intermediate between complete isolation and complete. Some mosasaur species appear to have been genuinely global in distribution, with specimens from widely separated localities showing very similar morphological features, while others appear to have been more geographically restricted, suggesting that barriers to dispersal existed for some taxa. The ocean currents of the late Cretaceous, constructed from geological and geochemical evidence, played an important role in shaping mosasaur distribution. Warm water lower to higher latitudes would have extended thermally suitable habitat toward the poles, potentially allowing mosasaurs to explore marine environments during the warmest Cretaceous. Zones where deep water was brought to the would have been areas of particularly high activity, attractive to large food concentrations supported. The mosasaur fossil locales reasonably well with Cretaceous ocean currents, suggesting that oceans influenced where these ended. Seasonal or movements from one geography to another is another behavioral possibility consistent with the mosasaur's swimming capabilities and water distribution. Large marine prey take long following prey that itself migrates seasonally between different ocean regions. If late Cretaceous prey hurdles or food sources under generations as logical equivalents, it would have been advantageous for mobilities of these animals sufficient for such. The O signals before final million-end Cretaceous, roughly 5 million year period, logical and shows signs of ocean ecosystem, even big event that would destroy them. Under extinction stress for a mosasaur store, as they provide extinction event itself and of how the mosasaurs were faring ecologically in their final years. The most significant ocean stress is certainly the Deccan, an enormous rock in what is subcontinent, representing one of the large events of the Cenozoic eras. Traps eruption event, but a massive lava flows that occurred over hundreds of millions of years, spanning the boundary between the late Cretaceous and early Paleogene. These eruptions released enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere, consequences for ocean chemistry. The climate effects are debated, episodes of cooling aerosols in sunlight with longer-term elevated greenhouse gases. Chemistry was affected by acid-form atmosphere, evolved into its pH chemistry. These oceanic stress the shells, the amine microplankton shells, the reef and other invertebrates of the food web. Paleontologists have extinction stressing measurable declines in marine biodiversity and ecosystem productivity before the asteroid impact that ultimately drove the extinction event. Evidence cited includes reductions in the diversity of some marine plankton groups, changes in the composition of ammonite communities, and possibly some reduction in mosasaur diversity in the very latest Cretaceous compared to peak diversity somewhat earlier. These observations are debated. The fossil record is inherently imperfect, and distinguishing real biological signals from artifacts of preservation and sampling is always challenging, but they suggest that the late Cretaceous ocean may not have been operating at peak health in its very final chapter. If the late Cretaceous ocean was already somewhat stressed before the asteroid impact, this has implications for how we think about the extinction event itself. An ecosystem already under metabolic stress, with declining productivity at its base, would have been less resilient to additional perturbation than a fully healthy system at its peak function. The asteroid impact, when it came, delivered a shock of such magnitude that even a fully healthy ecosystem would almost certainly have collapsed, but a pre-stressed ecosystem might have been even less able to absorb and recover from the shock, contributing to the totality of the eventual extinction. For the mosasaurs specifically, any pre-extinction reduction in food web productivity would have had cascading effects upward through the predatory hierarchy. As a top predator, Mosasaurus was dependent on a long chain of energy transformations below it in the food web, and any disruption to that chain, any reduction in productivity at the base, would have been amplified in its effects on the animals at the top. This is a general principle of food web ecology. Disturbances at the base tend to have their most severe consequences for top predators, because the top predators are the most dependent on the full, functional operation of the entire chain below them. The asteroid, the end of the world, and now we come to the event itself, the most dramatic and consequential geological incident of the past 100 million years of Earth history. the impact of a massive extraterrestrial object with the Earth's surface at the end of the Cretaceous period, approximately 66 million years ago. This event, the Chicxulub impact, named for the crater it left beneath what is today the Yucatan Peninsula, is the most well-documented and most studied mass extinction event in the geological record, and understanding its mechanisms and consequences is essential for understanding why the Mosasaurus, along with approximately 3/4 of all species on Earth, ceased to exist. The object that struck the Earth was large. Estimates place its diameter in the range of 10 to 15 kilometers, roughly the distance across a major city. Moving at an extraordinary velocity, perhaps 20 kilometers per second or more, it carried a kinetic energy almost beyond comprehension. Estimates place the energy released upon impact in the range of tens of billions of the most powerful nuclear weapons ever constructed, released essentially instantaneously into the Earth's crust and atmosphere at the moment of collision. The impact location, a shallow coastal sea underlain by sulfur-rich carbonate rock, was particularly unfortunate because the vaporization of the sulfur-rich substrate added an enormous additional load of sulfate aerosols to the atmospheric injection that the impact itself produced. The immediate physical consequences of the impact were catastrophic on a regional scale, but did not themselves account for the global extinction that followed. The crater, hundreds of kilometers across, was a zone of absolute destruction. Everything within many hundreds of kilometers of the impact site was killed instantly by the blast wave, the heat pulse, and the earthquake and tsunami effects. But the global extinction required global mechanisms, and those mechanisms operated through the atmosphere. The impact launched enormous quantities of rock, dust, soot, and vaporized material into the atmosphere. Some of it ejected with sufficient velocity to leave the atmosphere temporarily before re-entering as a global rain of superheated particles that ignited wildfires across much of the planet's land surface. The soot from those wildfires, combined with the fine dust and sulfate aerosols already in the atmosphere from the impact itself and from the continuing Deccan volcanism, created a dense, global atmospheric layer that dramatically reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface. This reduction in sunlight, a global dimming lasting months to years, was the key mechanism of the marine extinction. Sunlight is the energy source for photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is the foundation of virtually all ocean food webs through the phytoplankton, the microscopic, photosynthetic organisms that form the base of the marine food chain. When sunlight was blocked by the impact ejecta, phytoplankton photosynthesis collapsed. Phytoplankton populations crashed. The zooplankton that fed on phytoplankton found their food source gone, and their own populations followed. The small fish and invertebrates that fed on zooplankton starved. The larger animals that fed on those smaller animals faced the same fate. The food web collapsed from the bottom up, and the collapse propagated rapidly upward through every trophic level. For Mosasaurus, this food web collapse was the actual mechanism of extinction. The asteroid impact did not kill mosasaurs directly, not the global population, not even most of them. The ocean was not instantly rendered lethal to marine life by the impact. Instead, what the impact did was destroy the food web that Mosasaurus depended upon, destroy it at its very base, by blocking the sunlight needed for photosynthesis, and allow that destruction to propagate upward through the food chain until even the top predators had nothing left to eat. This is why the extinction of Mosasaurus is not a story of a weak animal being outcompeted or overcome. It is a story of a magnificently successful, superbly adapted predator being starved to death by the collapse of the entire ecological system that made its existence possible. There was nothing in the biology of Mosasaurus, no adaptation, however sophisticated, no behavioral flexibility, however great, that could have compensated for the disappearance of the food web. An apex predator at the top of a food chain is the most dependent element in the system on the full, functional operation of all the links in the chain below it. When those links broke, catastrophically and nearly simultaneously, the apex predator had no recourse. The time scale over which this starvation-driven extinction played out was likely not decades or centuries, but years to decades, fast in human terms, essentially instantaneous in geological terms. Population after population of marine animals declined as food availability fell below the minimum needed to sustain reproduction, then to sustain survival. Individuals that were larger, with greater stored energy reserves, might have survived longest, but without reproduction, populations cannot persist even if individuals survive for a time. The mathematical logic of population biology is inexorable. A population that cannot reproduce will eventually go extinct, regardless of how long the longest-lived individuals survive. There is an important and often overlooked nuance to the story of the end Cretaceous marine extinction that deserves emphasis. Not all marine animals went extinct. The K/PG extinction event was devastating, perhaps the most severe biotic crisis the oceans had experienced since the end Permian extinction 186 million years earlier, but it was not perfectly indiscriminate. Some groups of marine animals survived the extinction event and either recovered relatively quickly or gave rise to the successful lineages of the modern ocean. The survivors included many groups of fish, particularly bony fish, that were able to survive on reduced food availability through behavioral flexibility, reduced metabolic demands, or access to food sources, like detritus and organic material settling from above, that were less immediately affected by the collapse of photosynthetic primary production. Some sharks survived, their populations reduced but not eliminated. Marine turtles survived, again with reduced populations. Many groups of marine invertebrates, though certainly not all, survived, including some that would diversify spectacularly in the Paleocene and Eocene as the oceans recovered and new ecological opportunities opened. The pattern of survival and extinction is instructive. The groups that went extinct, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, ammonites, the calcareous marine microplankton, were those most dependent on the continuous, high-level functioning of the photosynthesis-based food web, either because they required the high caloric input that only a fully productive food web could supply, or because they themselves were directly part of the productive plankton base. The groups that survived tended to be those with lower energy requirements, greater metabolic flexibility, or access to food sources not entirely dependent on the immediate photosynthetic productivity of the surface ocean. Mosasaurus, as a large, active, warm-blooded or near-warm-blooded apex predator with enormous caloric requirements, was among the most vulnerable of all marine animals to a sudden, sustained collapse of food web productivity. It needed enormous amounts of food continuously to maintain its body functions and its activity levels. When that food began to disappear, first the small organisms at the base of the web, then progressively the larger ones, there was no way for an animal of Mosasaurus metabolic scale to compensate. It needed too much, and it had nowhere to turn when what it needed disappeared. The final years, what the last mosasaurs faced, let us try to reconstruct, as faithfully as the evidence allows, what the final years of the Mosasaurus might have looked like, not as a single individual's experience, which the fossil record obviously cannot provide, but as an ecological narrative of a population facing an unprecedented and ultimately unsurvivable challenge. In the years immediately before and during the collapse of the Cretaceous food web, the ocean would have been changing in ways that even an apex predator could not have failed to notice, in a purely ecological sense. The most immediate changes would have been in the abundance and behavior of prey. Fish schools, previously reliable and abundant, would have been smaller, thinner, and more erratic in their distribution as the zooplankton they fed on became less available. Ammonites, previously so abundant as to be practically omnipresent in appropriate water depths, would have been declining, their populations crashing as the plankton they fed upon disappeared. Marine turtles, fewer now and potentially behaving abnormally as they too faced food shortages, would have been harder to find. For a population of Mosasaurus, the first detectable effects of this prey decline would have been reduced average body condition, animals that were thinner than normal, carrying less stored energy in the form of fat reserves, because they were expending more energy in search of prey than they were consuming in prey captured. Reduced body condition has cascading effects on animal populations. Reduced immune function making animals more susceptible to disease and parasites, reduced reproductive output as females lack the energy reserves needed for successful gestation and birth of young, and increased mortality as marginal individuals, the very young, the old, the previously injured, succumb to starvation. The decline in reproductive success would have been particularly severe. Mosasaurs producing live young required substantial energy investment in gestation, and females in poor body condition would have been unable to sustain successful pregnancies. The recruitment of new young into the population would have fallen sharply, while adult mortality simultaneously increased. The population would have entered a demographic death spiral from which, under ordinary circumstances, a recovery might eventually have been possible, but these were not ordinary circumstances. The food web collapse was not a temporary local perturbation but a global, sustained catastrophe. There was no recovery trajectory available. The last individual Mosasaurus, the final member of a lineage that had ruled the ocean for tens of millions of years, died at some point in the years or decades following the impact, probably no more than a few thousand years after the K/PG, probably much less. It died not in spectacular combat, not defeated by some superior predator, but in the manner of all starvation victims, weakening, slowing, eventually unable to catch even the few prey animals still present in a devastated ocean, and finally stopping. The ocean closed over it as it had closed over countless mosasaurs before it, but this time there were no others to carry the lineage forward. The ocean that this last Mosasaurus died in was a shadow of the warm, productive, teeming world that had sustained the lineage for so long. Dark with impact aerosols, cold by late Cretaceous standards, nearly silent at the microscopic scale where the photosynthetic humming of phytoplankton had once driven the entire system, it was an ocean in the early stages of a long, painful, ultimately successful recovery. But that recovery would take millions of years, and it would not include the mosasaurs. They were gone. Aftermath: the ocean without mosasaurs. The recovery of marine ecosystems following the end Cretaceous extinction event is one of the great ecological stories of Earth history, a story of destruction and renewal, of ecological voids filled by new lineages, and of the extraordinary resilience of life even in the face of near-total collapse. Understanding this recovery helps us appreciate what was lost when the mosasaurs went extinct and what their absence meant for the subsequent history of the ocean. In the immediate aftermath of the K/PG extinction, the first hundreds of thousands of years of the Paleocene, the ocean was in a state of profound ecological disruption. The diversity of marine life had been drastically reduced. Complex, multi-layered food webs of the late Cretaceous were gone, replaced by much simpler, lower diversity communities dominated by opportunistic species capable of surviving on the detritus and dissolved organic material that was the main energy currency of the disrupted ocean. The ocean was, in ecological terms, a broken system slowly beginning the long process of reassembly. The reassembly of ocean food webs after the K/PG event took millions of years. Phytoplankton genera that expand our understanding of mosasaur diversity, sometimes new species within known genera that refine our understanding of their taxonomy and biogeography. Some of these new species come from localities that were previously unexplored or underexplored, extending the known geographical and temporal range of the group and filling gaps in our picture of mosasaur distribution and diversity through time. Particularly exciting are discoveries of exceptionally preserved specimens that retain soft tissue outlines, skin impressions, or other features going beyond the typically preserved skeletal material. Each such specimen has the potential to provide information about external appearance, physiology, or behavior that cannot be inferred from bones alone, and the growing body of such specimens is progressively giving us a more detailed and accurate picture of what mosasaurs looked like as living animals. The application of new analytical techniques to existing museum collections is also an important avenue of ongoing research. Techniques like computed tomography, CT scan, the internal structure of fossil bones to be examined in detail without destructive sampling, revealing features of growth rates, bone histology, and inner ear anatomy that could not previously be studied in rare or irreplaceable specimens. Isotopic analyses of fossil material, using increasingly sophisticated methods and growing databases of comparative data, are providing new information about mosasaur physiology, diet, and ecology that complements and sometimes challenges interpretations based on anatomical evidence alone. Computational biomechanical modeling is allowing researchers to test hypotheses about mosasaur locomotion, feeding mechanics, and sensory capabilities in ways that go beyond purely descriptive anatomy. The field of ancient DNA research, the recovery and analysis of genetic material from fossil specimens, has revolutionized our understanding of many extinct organisms, but mosasaurs present significant challenges for this approach. Genetic material degrades rapidly on geological timescales, and the conditions needed for its preservation over millions of years are exceptionally specific and rarely met.